Quick question. Who do you think would win in this fight? Netero with his 100-type Guanyin Bodhisattva, or Hashirama with his true several thousand hands? Let me know your answer in the comments below. Anyway, on to the video. Like all their predicaments in L.A.G, Jeong stepped forward to resolve it. Who else could do it if not him? Dwayne was too smooth-brained to handle such complex situations, and Kara couldn't even be trusted to keep her cheeks consistent, let alone deal with this. Thus, our boy wisely stepped up and sent out his skelly Chad to scout the way. The poor fellow was all too familiar with its expendable nature by now, so it quietly went forward. After walking for a bit, the fog completely consumed it, and it disappeared from the trio's view. Though they hadn't seen what happened, it didn't take a genius to guess the fucker was cooked, and most likely, it wouldn't be coming back. Jeong's action of recalling his shattered bones further confirmed this point. After mulling it over for a bit, Jeong decided to head inside solo. If the lightning fog was too much for the skelly Chad to endure, then it fell on him to stake it out. Obviously, the duo opposed this idea. They deemed it too dangerous, and instead suggested finding a different route to test out. But Jeong rejected their proposal. First of all, he had the lightning skill, and with its effect, he might be able to endure the lightning storm in the fog. Secondly, who's to say the door they'd been looking for wasn't in the fog? Wouldn't it be stupid if they detoured around it only to fuck themselves in the process? No matter the case, this was something he had to do. Kara understood his reasons, but she couldn't help but raise her concerns. She was truly getting a bad feeling from the fog. She confessed that her feelings had never been wrong. Ever since she was a kid, she'd always had a sixth sense about such things, and more often than not, she would be right. In fact, the tragic mystery of her disappearing cheeks had been foreseen by her, and she also knew things would change for the better soon. Jeong gently patted her head to reassure her. He told her not to worry too much. He'd be fine. He was Jeong motherfucking Hyeok. At the very least, he possessed the ability to protect himself, no matter what he faced inside. As for her prediction of her cheeks returning, he could already see them, and gyat damn. Them cheeks were really cheeking at this moment. Though he was reluctant, he forcibly peeled his eyes from the baddie and headed into the fog. As he walked, the worried voices of the duo reached him, telling him to be careful. Kara even said she'd be waiting for him, meaning it wasn't completely hopeless for our virgin Chad. If things aligned for him, then he might just get some cheeks in the future. Fingers crossed. Speaking of the baddie, she worriedly asked Dwayne if Jeong would be all right. Dwayne reassured her. If it was Jeong, then he was sure he'd be okay. The dude was just built different, and he doubted anything would stop him. As the two conversed, the scene switched to Jeong, the subject of Dwayne's glaze. Just like he'd expected, Jeong hadn't faced any difficulties yet, and the task was more like a leisurely walk to him at this point. However, whether or not that would continue to be the case was unclear. Jeong had the electric man and pain relief passive skills, so he was confident he could endure the lightning storm somehow. But for how long, even he didn't know. Well, he was going to give it his all anyway, so there wasn't much point in overthinking it. He immediately braced for impact, letting the lightning storm consume him soon after. When the storm struck, all of Jeong's past bravado completely disappeared. He wailed like a little bitch, forced onto his knees almost immediately. Whatever pain he thought he'd feel, this was way worse. In fact, it was so bad Jeong started to doubt L.A.G. Was this because he had a baddie and some glossy cheeks waiting for him? Because who else but the hating author would punish him to this degree? Well, even if it was him, this alone couldn't shake his resolve. He immediately exerted himself, slowly rising to his feet. Because of his passive skills, his body was slowly but surely adapting to the storm, and it wouldn't be long until he conquered it. And so, with that in mind, Jeong slowly walked forward, delving deeper and deeper into the fog. After seemingly an eternity of pain, he finally walked out of the fog, finding himself on the opposite side of the hall. The first thing he did was assess his situation, and to his shock, he realized that he'd powered up. Because of his electric man skill, the storm was like a supercharger to him. It further buffed his abilities, giving him unprecedented power. The only shame was that the buff was temporary, and he could only use it once before it completely disappeared. Even so, this was still a significant advantage, and Jeong couldn't help but feel more reassured about his incoming scout. After walking for a bit, a noteworthy change finally appeared before Jeong. It was another door, similar to the one that brought them to that section of the labyrinth. He wasted no time, instantly entering through the door. What met him was another dark hallway, this one way darker than the last. In the depths of the shadows, several obscured figures reigned, quietly whispering amongst themselves. Jeong immediately went on high alert. He activated his owl eyes, finally getting a clear view of the room. All around him were those weird naked freaks, the same nudist bastards as Derek, chest to nuts. As he noticed them, the nudist colony also noticed Jeong, and their whispers instantly shifted to discussing him. They brought up the fact that Jeong had managed to arrive there while still intact. Evidently, he had a lightning skill to deal with the fog lightning storm. But so what? He was still going to die there, and there wasn't much he could do about it. The leader of the nudists initiated contact. She asked Jeong why he was staying quiet even after seeing them, but Jeong ignored her. He instead focused on what the nudists had been whispering about. From their short discussion, he deduced that the reason the bastards were charred black was because of the lightning storm. As for what the exact details were, he still had no idea. He then asked his own question, inquiring whether he'd find the Minotaurus if he proceeded forward. The black-faced motherfuckers collectively laughed at his question, finding it hilarious. Their leader, Glenn Ryder, responded to Jeong's question. She told him that the boss's room was indeed ahead, but whether or not he'd find the boss inside the room was unknown. Jeong nodded to her reply before asking another question. Were they still human? Glenn responded rather smugly. Of course they were human. It's just that they were an evolved species of humans. They were faster, stronger, felt no pain, and most importantly, if you could overlook the black face, then they were naked walking fan service for all to enjoy. The only limitation, which wasn't actually a disadvantage in their books, was that they had an insatiable desire to consume flesh, specifically human flesh. So, him walking in there was like a lucky turn for them, almost like he'd personally delivered himself to be devoured. Jeong snickered at her comment before replying. First of all, if there was anyone who was lucky, then it had to be him and the homies watching this video. Because how often would they get a chance to see some anime boobies and nippies? And secondly, it seemed she didn't know who he was. He was the big dog, MILF hunting, Jeong motherfucking Hyeok. The only thing he came to deliver was their deaths. Glenn said bet to his bold words before commanding the nudist colony to attack. And as expected from these barbaric fuckers, they were all cheeks out as they charged at our boy. Jeong responded in kind. He immediately activated his limitation form, urging the bastards to come at him. Since they were fiends who confessed to loving human meat, especially his meat, he didn't need to hold back against them. He would clap them all, specifically this bastard who decided to flash a lot more than just cheeks. Pause. As the cheeky fuckers charged at him, Jeong entered his karate, whoop-ass fighting stance. He channeled his left-right goodnight, lightning punch, driving his fist into the nudist's face. The blow was so powerful that its eye burst out before it was yeeted into the sky. Obviously, its partners didn't take this lying down. They charged at Jeong from the left, the right, and even from above, successfully completing a three-way pincer attack. But Jeong wasn't flustered. He gathered his energy before shooting it all out, sinking the entire room into his lightning domain. Wherever the bolt struck, chaos reigned, zapping the living shit out of the nudists. However, despite the CHADY display, the bastards weren't that easy to deal with. Only a single nudist suffered lethal damage, while the rest just tanked it. Even though they'd be dazed for a while, it wouldn't affect the general battle much. Jeong immediately noticed this and went on high alert. He identified the black color on the nudist's skin as the true cause of their survival. From his analysis, the color wasn't just a convenient effect for the author to hide the good stuff. It also served as an insulator, protecting the naked folk from lightning. Since things had turned out like that, Jeong instantly changed his fighting style. He switched to the in-your-face bitch slap and cheek slash, instead of ranged lightning strikes. With the choice made, Jeong immediately acted on it. He sidekicked the hell out of the first nudist, sending it flying like a broken kite. One of the nudists capitalized on this moment to launch a sneak attack, but Jeong easily dodged that sly hoe. He responded with a vertical slash, aiming straight for its skull. Though the attack landed and dealt significant damage, it was still pointless, because the bastard had purposely sacrificed its arm, saving its life and stalling Jeong in the process. If he continued to fight at this tempo, he'd soon be swarmed and jumped. His defeat wouldn't be surprising afterward. Jeong realized this and changed his fighting style again. This time, he went for the punch-a-bitch no jutsu, yeeting the crap out of a nudist. For the rest of the charging bastards, he yelled at them to come at him. There was plenty of ass where that whoop came from. And he meant it too, because he immediately dished out 2 killer crosses, clocking 2 bastards in the jaw. Unfortunately, his momentum was disrupted by a sneak attack from the back, causing him to groan in pain. In fact, if it wasn't for his absurd passive skills, he might have fractured his spine from that blow. Luckily, he was him, and he instantly recovered, countering with a forehead block. The attacking nudist was caught off guard by such an odd move, leaving it open for a counterattack. Jeong didn't waste this opportunity and directly shoved his fist into the fucker's mouth. He channeled his electricity and burst its head, sending chunks of flesh flying like a squashed tomato. Another foe closed in for a sneak attack, but Jeong instantly responded, bitch slapping the hell out of it. He then followed up with a sweep attack before finishing it off with a stomp to the head. As he was busy dealing with the first nudists, another one pulled up behind him again, going for yet another sneak attack. This time, however, things were different. Jeong's danger sense suddenly flared, warning him of an impending calamity. He didn't hesitate or question it, just dived to the side to dodge. Luckily, he did, because the attack turned out to be so powerful that literal shockwaves were heard from the force. When Jeong saw this, he immediately opened his second door of limitation. The new nudist was obviously different from the rest, and playing around wouldn't do him any good. He first stepped on its foot before cocking his hand back for a killer uppercut. Because its leg was trapped, the fiend didn't fly away, but instead remained firmly within Jeong's grasp. Our boy didn't hesitate to give it the Wayne Brady treatment, firmly choking that hoe. And since he was him, he ruthlessly tore off its neck, taking a chunk of flesh as his battle spoils. Surprisingly, even though its neck was torn off, the bastard didn't immediately die. It first glazed our boy, telling him he was hella strong. The rest of the colony saw their leader fall and immediately went into a frenzy. They charged at Jeong with madness, disregarding their own lives. However, before they could send themselves to their doom, a loud voice called for them to retreat. And although reluctant, they all pulled back. Jeong was left alone in the middle, and honestly, he looked like shit. When Jeong saw them retreating, he flashed an evil smile. His face was particularly demonic, with the blood trickling down like tears. The nudists witnessed this and became enraged. Did this Jeong bastard really think they were afraid of him? They collectively charged forward, disregarding their orders to retreat. Jeong smiled even broader at this. This was exactly what he wanted. He immediately summoned back his bone blade, making a wide slash around him. When the dust settled, we realized that the slash wasn't just to farm some aura. Our boy had actually extended his bone blade, cutting through the encirclement of nudists like butter. The slash was so devastating that several limbs were cut in the process, the nudists forever maimed as a consequence. Glen's heart bled at this loss. She bellowed at the colony to retreat, this time her voice leaving no room for defiance. The nudists wisely listened and backpedaled, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and Jeong. When she saw her colony was safe, Glen heaved a sigh of relief before addressing Jeong once again. She asked him to join them. He was to abandon his humanity and become a nudist like them. She promised the change would be extremely beneficial to him, an improvement in strength being just the basics. But Jeong instantly shot her down. He had no desire to crawl on walls and eat humans, let alone be butt-naked and flash his cheeks across the manhwa panels. If he did that, then the Chad Not would have a hard time saying pause after every scene, which, in truth, would be quite a chore. However, if he were being honest, the boost in their physical characteristics was indeed quite tempting. If he took her up on that offer, who knows how many inches he'd gain as a result. Pause. Glen sighed at his refusal before saying something about food, but honestly, I couldn't care less because my full focus was on them melons and nippies. Damn, holy melons. Luckily, Jeong wasn't as thirsty as I was. He fully focused on Glen, racking his brain to figure out an escape plan. It wasn't that he was afraid of them. On the contrary, he was quite confident he could clap any of them in a one-on-one duel. However, the current situation wouldn't allow that. The bastards would definitely swarm him, and their numbers were too many for him to launch an effective counterattack. There was always the option of opening the third limitation door, but Jeong quickly ruled out that idea. The backlash and unknown consequences were too severe for him to casually make that move. So long as he wasn't forced to, he wouldn't make that choice. Jeong then thought about his other options, one of them being retreating to the lightning storm to recharge. However, this idea was also eliminated. If he did that, then there was a huge possibility he'd draw the enemy with him and implicate Dwayne and Kara in the process. Dwayne was okay. He could go die as far as he was concerned. But Kara couldn't die. She'd promised him some cheeks after all. If great wars could be fought because of cheeks, why couldn't he sacrifice his life for the same? That was just pure logic. Well, more like CHADY logic. With so many ideas ruled out, Jeong was left in an awkward situation. He didn't know what to do, and Glenn was also adding pressure to the situation by commanding her soldiers to attack. If it wasn't for her glorious peaks and nippies, then Jeong would be hella upset with her. Too bad she held the visual advantage in this case. Just when his situation was at rock bottom and his demise was proving inevitable, an idea suddenly struck Jeong. He ignored the charging nudists and locked all the fuck in. When the first nudist lunged at him, his aura suddenly turned dark. So dark that the limitation demonic aura was nothing in comparison. Official debut, the madness skill had finally been unleashed. While under the effects of madness, the whole world seemed to have slowed down before Jeong. The nudists were moving so slow it was almost like they were toying with him. But Jeong knew this wasn't a game. He also knew the nudists weren't slow at all. It was his speed that was ridiculously fast. In fact, he was so fast that bitch slapping and Brady choking the nudists wouldn't be a challenge to him. With this realization, Jeong immediately started his counterattack. He first grabbed the leading nudist, breaking its arm in the process. He then grabbed its face, flashed a sadistic smile, before ripping that fucker clean off. Just when I thought he couldn't get more savage, Jeong actually threw the face, yeeting another nudist in the face with it. He followed up with a lunge before karate chopping the shit out of the second nudist. Under the might of his blow, the poor fellow lost its eye, the bastard popping right off. A third nudist used that chance to strike back, kicking Jeong straight in the jaw. But Jeong easily tanked that shit, launching his counterattack immediately after. He grabbed the fool's leg before punching straight through its skull. Yes, I shit you not. Our boy straight up punched through a skull. Talk about aura. The rest of the nudists saw this and doubled their assault. It was obvious how livid they were. But again, Jeong wasn't flustered. He simply grabbed his third victim and threw it at them, playing a real-life version of whack-a-bitch, whack-a-mole. Unfortunately, his long session of aura farming finally came to an end with Glenn's ambush. And just like her name, she rode that heel deep into Jeong's spine. Or maybe it was his ass. It was hard to tell from this angle. However, from how his legs were curled up like that, I'm leaning towards the latter. She then comboed the assault, kicking the hell out of our boy. Jeong instantly found himself in quite a pathetic situation. Not only was his ass getting whooped, but he also couldn't get an opening to counterattack, meaning this ass whooping was going to last for a while. But even if that was the case, it wasn't like he was completely helpless. Though Glenn's speed was absurdly high, so high that he couldn't quite keep up, he could still follow her movements with his eyes. If he used that fact and predicted her actions, then it wasn't hard to counter. Just like this. Gotcha, bitch. He grabbed hold of Glenn, scaring the shit out of the latter. With his sadistic smile still radiating, Jeong tightened his grip, breaking Glenn's arm like a twig. The overwhelming pain sent the black baddie into a frenzy. She responded with an upper kick, clocking Jeong straight in the jaw. But our boy didn't relent. He exerted more force, yanking Glenn's arm from her body. Before the baddie could scream, Jeong clasped her mouth, then her face, before lifting her into the air. Through CHADY dominance, he slammed that hoe into the ground, crushing the whole floor in the process. Jeong smiled at this massacre, but deep down, he was hella anxious. This wasn't him. He'd completely lost himself to the skill, and currently, even his body wasn't under his control. If he couldn't snap himself back, then there was a huge possibility he might just die there. Damn it, Lag, just how many traps do you have? As Jeong was still cursing the hellish game, his hand instinctively pressed harder on Glenn's neck, firmly choking that hoe. And contrary to what I was expecting, the bitch actually died, leaving behind her soul and, of course, a quick peek at them cheeks. Jeong sighed regretfully at the concealing paint before shifting his focus to the rest of the nudists. If the Chads watching couldn't get a clear view of Glenn's plot, then he might as well compensate them by clapping some nudists' cheeks. Luckily, the bastards had fallen into chaos after losing their leader, so stomping on them wouldn't be much of a challenge to him. He immediately acted on this, charging forward with the momentum of a crazed beast. The first to feel his wrath was nudist number, who gives a fuck, who instantly got cleaved in half, his innards scattered across the labyrinth floor. Jeong then pounced on the second and third nudists, decapitating one and ripping the throat of the other. He then turned to the next nudist, digging his claws into its guts and pulling out its innards. When even that wasn't enough to satiate his frenzy, he lunged at the next nudist, ripping out its tongue. Just like a crazed fiend, Jeong continued his massacre, blood and flesh chunks continuously littering the ground. When the last of the nudists fell, he raised his head and roared, venting out the darkest of his carnage desires. All around him were the mangled corpses of the nudists, most of them maimed beyond recognition, and the culprit for this massacre just stood there, idly enjoying the bloodshed. You might be fooled into thinking he was contemplating his actions, but in truth, he'd already forgotten about them. Instead, he focused on how he could effectively use the souls. Though it was sad they'd been killed and forgotten so easily, this was L.A.G. Expecting compassion from this hell was pure lunacy. And unfortunately, the lunacy extended not just to the nudists, but to Jeong as well. Since the madness skill was still in effect, Jeong found himself charging for the door, his own wishes be damned. The crazed look and bloodlust were all his consciousness needed to realize what his body was planning. The mad fool was going after Dwayne and Kara. It seemed the madness hadn't had enough carnage and was thus targeting the squad. Jeong instantly knew this was a problem, but he was helpless to resolve it. While under the effect of madness, his body was not in his control, so he couldn't stop even if he wanted to. Although he cried bitterly inside, he already knew he would be the cause of Dwayne's and Kara's deaths, likely ripping them to pieces. But who was he? He was Jeong Hyeok. How could he give up so easily? How could he lose to a mediocre skill? He immediately locked in, wrestling for control of his legs. With that as a foundation, Jeong controlled his lower body, finally putting an end to his charge. Through gritted teeth, he held on with all his might before eventually ridding himself of the madness effect. After a series of deep breaths, Jeong acknowledged his good luck for once. If he hadn't been nearing the end of the madness skill, he wouldn't have been able to hold on, and who knows what might have happened to Dwayne and Kara. Luckily, the situation was salvaged, and he could still collect the glossy cheeks Kara promised him. As he walked back to the nudist's room, Jeong reflected on the intricacies of the madness skill. Although it was undoubtedly overpowered, he decided not to use it casually unless he was truly at death's door. Such a skill was too risky, especially since he had his squad with him. Locking back in, Jeong leisurely collected the souls from the nudists, and thanks to their generous donations, he now had a whopping 370 souls to spare. He giddily pocketed all the souls, even entertaining the thought of sharing some with Dwayne and Kara. Dwayne wasn't all that important, but how would Kara react? Would she introduce him to her brother, Hawk 2, as thanks? Or maybe her sister, Gawk 3000? Both cases would be fine, and honestly, he'd take anything at this point. Following Jeong's glare, the thirsty narrator refocused on the story. He shifted his attention to the dark hallway, a lone door hidden in its depths. Jeong quickly approached the door before cautiously heading inside. When he did, a system notification popped up announcing that he'd entered the main room of the labyrinth. Jeong ignored the notification as he silently studied the room. To his shock, he discovered the room had an uncanny resemblance to the starting point of L.A.G, the very same room that had started this shit. Even though he was shaken, he quickly calmed down before looking for the familiar lever hidden in the wall. Pressing it opened a secret door, just like in the starting room. With zero hesitation, Jeong walked into the light, slowly entering the crystal room. As he scanned the familiar sight, another notification sounded, informing him that he could morph into a labyrinth resident in that room. As for who the residents were, they were obviously the nudists. The process was simple. All he had to do was place his hand on the terminal, and the system would handle the rest. If he did that, then he'd receive all the perks of the nudists, and then some. Jeong mulled it over as he slowly unraveled the mysteries of the transformation. From his deduction, he realized that all his accumulation, his skills, and souls would be traded in for the passive skill Labyrinth Man. It was this skill that gave the fucker nudists the abilities they had. Were he to accept, he would evolve into a being more suited for darkness, while his grade and characteristics would be determined by his accumulation. At level 3, he wouldn't be able to walk or talk, just like the fallen Derek Chestnut. At level 4, he'd be just like Clint, barely able to talk while significantly stronger than level 3. At level 5, he'd be like Glenn, stronger than level 4 and able to communicate fluently. Of course, he wouldn't have the holy melons and cakes Glenn had, but that's neither here nor there. As for levels above 5, he was sure they existed, but the system didn't share details about them. Thinking back to the nudists, Jeong realized they already knew the exit's location. It was just that they couldn't defeat the Minotaur, so they were forced to stay there. From their actions, he deduced that the bastards were probably biding their time, hunting new arrivals, and leveling up their nudist skill with hopes of defeating the Minotaur in the future. Too bad all their plans and preparations went belly up because of him. But if that was the case, how did the bastards get their resistance to lightning? Was that also a part of their transformation? This question stumped Jeong, and he couldn't figure it out no matter how hard he thought about it. Luckily, he didn't have to sweat too much, as L.A.G easily gave him an answer. The solution was insulator paint. It would protect the user from electricity if sprayed all over the body. Turns out the nudists weren't just doing so to hide the cheeks. The black paint had tactical significance all along. Of course, just because it's tactical doesn't mean we can overlook its heinous crimes. Do you know how many times I zoomed in on them cheeks to no avail? Someone has to answer for that, and I'm blaming this stupid paint. Jeong also got heated after receiving the paint, but his focus was on something else entirely. He realized that Dwayne and Kara would also be able to cross the lightning fog if they used the paint, but that was only secondary. What was truly important was that Kara had to be butt naked to use the paint, not to mention the nosebleed sight of her covered in spray. If things turned out well, both he and the homies watching this might just get the feast of a lifetime. Itadakimasu. With that glorious view in mind, Jeong resolutely headed back. How could he afford to waste time at such an important moment? He quickly left the crystal room, running back to the oblivious Kara. As he ran, he reflected on his journey in L.A.G so far. Initially, his goal was to survive and escape L.A.G, but things were different now. Not only did he want to escape, he also wanted to bring Kara and Dwayne with him. Escaping alone wasn't enough for him anymore. He wanted to save the duo and get the hell out of there together. Sure, it was going to be hard as fuck, but he was Jeong motherfucking Hyeok. He'd make it work somehow. Just as he was in high spirits, L.A.G spawned in to remind him what kind of place this was. It was hell, and such bitchy ideas wouldn't be tolerated. Before him was a ruined and bloody battlefield, an obvious indication that some shit had definitely happened to the duo. Jeong's heart sank at the sight, and he couldn't help but yell out Kara's name. Damn it, L.A.G. If something happens to her before he collects his owed cheeks, I won't forgive you. Jeong ignored the narrator's pointless banter and rushed forward. As far as he was concerned, Not's thirsty behavior came second. What was truly important was finding his crew. He looked around the room, calling out Dwayne and Kara's names, but what answered him were mere echoes. The duo was nowhere to be seen. An overwhelming feeling of anger and panic assaulted Jeong, and he couldn't help but punch the ground to vent his emotions. Damn it. What was this development? He'd just vowed to escape with the duo. Was he going to fail even before he started? What kind of shit luck was this? He didn't know who or what was responsible for this, whether they were a group or a solo unit. But one thing was for certain. He would kill them all. He would make sure they regretted ever laying their dirty hands on his crew, especially his baddie, Kara. Damn it. He hadn't even held her hand yet. Was he really destined to die a tragic virgin in this game? He hoped the fuck not. Calming his wild heart, Jeong quickly used a skill to regain his composure. I would have mentioned the exact name of the skill, but I'm pretty sure it's not self-composure, as mentioned in the translation. In fact, I'm so confident I could bet my left nut and Dwayne's right titty that it's not that. The translators are just doing whatever they want at this point. Anyway, after using the definitely not self-composure skill, Jeong finally regained some clarity. This wasn't the time to lose himself in rage. It would only blind him and cause him to make mistakes. He needed to be calm. Only then would he be able to pick up the duo's trail and save them, if it was possible. With that in mind, Jeong quickly scanned the battlefield, doing his best to scour every inch of it. Thanks to his attention to detail, he quickly found valuable clues to pursue. One of them was smoke from Kara's fire skill. Another was wreckage from Dwayne's roar skill. Both were still fresh, so the duo must have left just recently. From the traces and the other clues, the signs pointed to them retreating into the lightning fog. However, if that was true, then things didn't bode well for them. Ignoring the ever-deepening pit in his gut, Jeong continued his investigation into the lightning fog. After a bit of tracking, he found the duo's traces, but they disappeared just as quickly as they appeared. With the limited info he had, there was no way of telling what had happened, but if the duo had been forced into the lightning without the paint to protect them, then their demise was proving all the more likely. Although it was sad to think about, there was indeed a high probability of that happening, so denying it was just pure ignorance. However, even if he was the most ignorant person alive, he decided to trust in the squad and ignore the clues. So what if the signs were clear? He was willing to bet his squad wouldn't die so easily. Forget Kara, because the mortality rate of baddies in L.A.G was horrendous. His hopes mainly lay in Dwayne. The giant unit was definitely him, so surviving shouldn't be a problem. And if he looked out for a brother and saved his baddie, then that would be even better. With renewed hope and a calmer heart, Jeong immediately returned to the crystal room. Since he was betting on his squad's survival, he had to do his part to survive as well. And the first thing was to clap the Minotaur. After finding and activating the hidden switch in the wall, Jeong watched calmly as the trapdoor activated, opening up a path to the boss room. Although he was itching for a glorious fight, he wasn't stupid. He also knew moving forward without Dwayne and Kara would be hella hard, so caution was necessary. The first thing he needed to do was calm himself and level up. Only then would he have a chance of survival. Thus, he quickly burned through his souls, leveling up a shit ton of skills. You can pause the video to get the exact details because ain't no way I'm reading all that shit. However, as compensation, feel free to imagine me nibbling on your ear. I'm sure that'll make the reading more pleasurable. You're welcome. After bawling the hell out and going on his leveling spree, Jeong successfully upgraded his skills, leaving only 7 souls as backup. With his preparations complete, he resolutely walked into the boss's room, ready to clap some Minotaur cheeks. However, as typical of L.A.G, things wouldn't be so simple. The moment he entered the room, the door immediately closed, blocking any routes for retreat. Not only that, he realized he wasn't the only person in the room. In fact, there were so many people, you'd think they were holding a party or something. Most of them were cool, with killer character designs, but some were just fucked up. Seriously, what in the Zuckerberg is this? With so many new arrivals and so much info to digest, Jeong almost missed the dead Minotaur on the floor. Turns out the boss was already dead, so his trip was for naught. But if that was the case, how come the system hadn't announced the mission's completion? Was there still something cooking in the background, or was L.A.G up to its shenanigans again? Just as he was pondering this point, a figure broke out of the group and silently approached him. He called out to Jeong, yelling that he reeked of blood. This nosy bastard was Jeremy Stone, who, like his name, had them stony abs. His public attribute was an increase in his sense of smell, and currently, his highest skill level was 22. Jeremy went on to question Jeong, asking why he reeked of blood. In fact, his scent was even worse than his own, and he was already a certified lunatic. But Jeong didn't answer. Instead, he raised his vigilance. Since Jeremy went through the trouble of closing the distance, he must be a close-range specialist. And adding that to his constant bullshit yapping, it was clear the bastard wanted some smoke. But to think he would so casually approach him alone. Just how confident was he in his skills? 2 more members broke out of the group, silently reinforcing Jeremy. One of them told him to cut his shit. This was L.A.G. Everyone reeked of blood in that hell. But Jeremy was adamant. He insisted that Jeong's stench was on another level. In fact, it was almost like he'd soaked in a pool of blood before coming there. Not to mention his highest skill level, 30. That wasn't a number that could be reached by ordinary means. Without a doubt, this Jeong bastard was one hell of a freak. The lizard motherfucker took this chance to approach Jeong. He directly extended an invitation, asking Jeong to join them. The other reinforcement quickly rejected the idea. He explained that the group was already in chaos. Most of them were already trying to kill each other. Adding Jeong would only make things worse. Jeremy countered his argument, insisting that it would be fine. And if he was referring to the time he had almost killed him, then that was already in the past. He should go ahead and forget it. Hadn't he apologized enough already? The headband bastard became enraged by his nonchalant attitude. He called Jeremy a coward, a real scam to call a teammate. Jeremy told him to cut the bullshit. He then said some racist shit, but I'm in no mood to translate as bullshit. The two instantly became heated, charging toward each other soon after. Just as they were about to clash, a third person joined the fray, perfectly blocking the two. He chastised them for being reckless, especially since they had a troublesome guest before them. Jeong also studied this foe, noting that he was hella fast. To be able to move with such speed, the bastard must have an acceleration skill or something. But if that was the case, did the skill affect only his movements? Or could he dish out speedy thrusts like the Flash? Pause. After being stopped, Jeremy instantly became a diss buffet, dishing out disses like crazy. Everyone became victims of his strays, and the whole group descended into madness. The commotion continued until the lizard Zuckerberg called for them to shut it. He warned Jeremy to watch himself. There was a limit to his tolerance and generosity. Jeremy instantly cowered, apologizing soon after. His face might be troubling, but it seemed this lizard fucker was the real deal. The only maiden in the group spoke up at that time. She called the men a bunch of idiots. How could they argue with a possible enemy before them? She was Morgane Doubled, and I'm sure if she removed the mask, my schlong would doubled in an instant. Currently, her highest skill level was 26. Jeong watched the madness before dissing the group. They were really a mess. Well, even if they were a train wreck, it had nothing to do with him because there was no way in hell he'd join them anyway. Jeremy heard Jeong's condescension and immediately got heated. He mad-dogged Jeong, asking what gave him the confidence to speak so brazenly. Jeong told him to cut the chit-chat. If he wanted smoke, then they should get on with it. Jeremy responded with, "Bet." He indeed wanted that smoke. Jeong told him, "Cool." That was exactly what he wanted as well. He'd been feeling rather awful lately, and a target to vent his frustration on was exactly what he needed. Since Jeremy had so generously volunteered to get smoked, he'd graciously accept and tear that ass up. No homo, of course. Jeremy involuntarily took a step back at Jeong's words. He'd known L.A.G was a harsh place, but who would have thought his delicate ass would be at risk as well? If that was the direction of this fight, then he might as well stop. He'd leave that sort of thing to Diddy. Jeong smiled at his tense face. It was exactly as he thought. More often than not, the loudest people were the most cowardly. If Jeremy was really about that smoke, he wouldn't be talking so much. He would have attacked immediately. Talking meant he was a coward, and cowards tended to die quickly in L.A.G. The rest of the party heard his words and didn't dispute them. On one hand, they were really tired of this Jeremy bastard. On the other hand, they were wary of Jeong, and sacrificing Jeremy to probe his abilities was a worthwhile trade in their books. So what if Jeremy died? It had nothing to do with them. In fact, it would be better for them if he did. The only thing they required was for him to draw out Jeong's abilities before he bit the dust. Jeong eyed the group and immediately knew what they were thinking. But so what? Was Jeong Big Papi Hyeok so easy to manipulate? If these fools thought they'd get their way so easily, they were dreaming. He would wreck any schemes they had and kill anyone who dared stand in his way. But first, he should get rid of this Jeremy fucker because he was also getting tired of his nonsense yapping. He easily sidestepped Jeremy's stab, causing the latter's attack to miss pathetically. Jeremy didn't let up. He instead doubled his assault, sending a flurry of stabs at Jeong. Jeong read the attacks and nimbly dodged them all. Such puny attacks weren't a threat to him. He then changed the tempo, clocking Jeremy square in the jaw. The blow left Jeremy dazed, forcing him to activate his trump card. 2 more daggers flew from his pants, joining his offensive. But how could Jeong let him do as he pleased? He rapidly closed in, his fist coated in lightning. With a mighty punch, he tore through Jeremy's jaw, sending the latter flying. Just like that, a cocky bastard fell. His yapping maw mangled beyond repair. Jeong nonchalantly collected his soul before turning to the party. What would they do now? Would they fight, or nah? The group remained silent for a while before this creepy Zuckerberg fucker spoke up. He expressed his nonchalance at Jeremy's death, but that didn't mean they wouldn't do anything about it. Though they hated the fool, he was still part of their group, so revenge was definitely appropriate. However, that was only his opinion. The rest would decide for themselves through a vote. After a bit of back and forth, the group settled for a split decision. Half wanted to attack, while the rest wanted to retreat. Jeong told them not to think too much. They'd get clapped regardless. In fact, his hands were rated E for everyone, so they could all get it. If they were still hesitant, they should just gang up on him. He was down for whatever. Lizardmark eyed him before frowning at his confidence. Since he was being that bold, it meant he was a monster, and such freaks weren't easy to kill. Even if it was possible, he didn't see the need to risk it for just Jeremy, so he wisely stepped back, dispelling any ideas of retaliation. As the two sides settled their dispute, the panel switched to the Minotaur. And just as we've grown to expect from L.A.G, some shit was brewing in the background. The corpse started to squirm before a bloody silhouette burst out from within. This sudden change caught everyone off guard, and they all collectively turned to face the new foe. Jeong, in particular, was getting a really bad feeling from the freak, a feeling that only amplified when he heard the bastard scream. No matter what it was, he knew shit was cooked, and it was about time he got his ass out of there. The new foe, the Burning Man, as the system called it, also studied the group, its eyes shining in amusement. It then locked in, its head setting ablaze. Before the group could react, the fiend lunged forward, grabbing Rushing Man by the face. The group gasped at the absurd speed before quickly backpedaling to save themselves. As for Rushing Man, he was left in the foe's hands, his head slowly setting ablaze. One team member rushed in to save him, stabbing Burning Man in the flank. Unfortunately, he was useless and got caught as well. Under the group's horrified gazes, the duo were killed, their heads reduced to cinders. And the worst part? They were completely helpless. They couldn't do shit to the fiend. Another team member charged forward, striking B-Man in the arm. Because of his bombing skill, the strike was actually effective, managing to sever its arm. But just like the last one, the fool was quickly yeeted, dying pathetically soon after. With 3 bodies to its name, Burning Man slowly walked forward, its domineering aura pressing down on the group. Jeong watched this, and the sickening feeling in his gut got more intense. He instinctively realized, fucking around at this point would instantly get him killed, especially since B-Man seemed to have absurd regeneration as well. No matter the case, now was the time to lock in. He couldn't afford to be careless. With that in mind, he called out to Lizard Mark, inquiring if he had some healing potions. The weird fool replied that he had some. But why was he asking? Jeong replied that it was obvious. He was going to clap some Burning Man cheeks. If the lizard could give him the potions, then he would help them kill the boss. If not, then they would all die there. The choice was up to him. Oh, and before he decided, he should know. He had some glossy cheeks waiting for him, so he better not fuck around. Pause. Jeong continued to urge, or rather, extort, the group. He told them to hand over their health potions, otherwise, he wouldn't move an inch even if the B-Man clapped them all. They might not have realized this, but the Burning Man hadn't looked at him since it appeared. His guess was that it was focused on the group that killed the Minotaur, so he should be safe until it killed them all. Lizard heard his analysis and frowned slightly. Now that he thought about it, there was indeed some truth to Jeong Bastard's words. But did they really have to give up their potions? Just as he was struggling with the choice, another member of the group stepped up. He cockily told Jeong to step back. He didn't need help from a petty bastard like him. Jeong told him to do as he pleased. He wouldn't care either way, even if the Burning Man tenderized his black ass. The Black Pirate told him, bet, he didn't need his help or concern anyway. He would solo the B-Man, so Jeong better stand back and watch. Saying so, he decisively dashed forward, activating a skill in the process. The skill was the fire resistance skill, so the fool had great confidence against the boss. He connected a right jab, sending the foe reeling. Just as he was about to celebrate his victory, the tables suddenly turned, catching him completely off guard. The Burning Man abruptly counterattacked, setting his arm ablaze. The cocky fool cried out in pain, horrified by the sudden change. But before he could piece together what the hell was going on, the B-Man pressed the attack, grabbing him by the head. Under the group's stunned gazes, the Burning Man tore off his head, incinerating it soon after. Jeong watched this passively before directing his focus to the surviving duo. He told them to make up their minds, lest they end up like Black Pirate. If they still insisted on stalling for time, then he'd abandon them, and he wouldn't help even if they begged him. Lizard considered his request before calling out to Morgane. He instructed her to hand over her potion, and although she was unwilling, she had no choice but to comply. Following her action, he also handed over his health potion, completing their side of the deal. Jeong received the items and couldn't help but smile. With the two serving as reassurance, he was free to crush out. Although he had no idea how bad things would get after he used madness and limitation, at the very least his life wouldn't be in danger. Thus, his frown gradually eased. Lizard saw his relaxed demeanor and threatened immediately. If he couldn't kill the boss, even after extorting them, then he'd forget everything and kill him instead. Jeong told him not to get ahead of himself. He couldn't kill him even if he tried, and besides, if he failed to kill the boss, then both of them would definitely die. So what's the point of threatening him? He encouraged them to stay still and watch as he saved their pitiful asses. With those words, Jeong immediately locked in. He traced the boss's gaze, realizing that it was still focused on the duo. Since that was the case, he'd be a fool if he didn't exploit it. He resolved to finish it in one move, lest Lag did the Lag thing and curveballed his ass. As for the exact strategy, he had a bunch to pick from, with the fourth door being one of them. However, that was just an idea. He wouldn't be stupid enough to actually try it. He hadn't even opened the third door, so opening the fourth door was pure lunacy, even if he had the medicine as backup. Speaking of the third door, he decided to give it a spin, and boy, was it OP. His aura suddenly radiated, suppressing the entire room. Jeong felt the power and couldn't help but gasp in surprise. If the third door was already this intense, then the fourth door would definitely tear him apart. Good thing he hadn't been greedy enough to directly open the fourth door. The duo saw his new form and asked if he was okay. He'd talked big game earlier, so how come he looked so terrible even before the fight began? If he ended up dying before actually fighting the boss, then that would truly be a joke. Jeong told them not to worry. Despite how he looked, he was golden. He warned them to stand back since the boss was attacking. He also cautioned them against moving even if the boss targeted them. Lizard heard his last words and immediately shouted for an explanation. Who would be stupid enough to stand still when their lives were on the line? Jeong told him to trust him. He had his reasons. Lizard said, "Bullshit," to that. If he couldn't properly explain himself, then he wasn't doing shit. Jeong replied that he had no time to explain it to him. If he wanted to survive, then he'd better trust him and stay still. Lizard shouted for an answer, but Jeong swiftly disappeared, leaving him to face the charging boss. An overwhelming fear and panic assaulted his weird ass, but he desperately held on, doing his best to stay still. Just as the boss's fist was about to crush his skull, Lizard couldn't take it anymore and shouted at Jeong to save him. Our boy spawned above the fiend, his bone blade ready. He yelled for Lizard to stay still, since everything was still in his control. Saying so, he activated his lightning skill, slashing the burning man cleanly in half. The force from the blow kicked up a lightning storm, creating a huge crater on the ground. Jeong gasped for breath, clearly strained by the power. He wisely deactivated the skill, choosing to minimize the backlash as much as possible. In addition, he also used the health potion, hoping it would speed up his recovery. With that done, he shifted his focus to the dying boss. However, even after a while, the system still hadn't sounded, meaning shit wasn't over just yet. Jeong frowned at this sight, wondering what was going on. Had his prediction been wrong and the Burning Man wasn't the true owner of the labyrinth? Or was there another owner lurking in the shadows somewhere? No matter the case, things weren't looking good, and it seemed Lag was about to start some bullshit again. Lizard also caught on to the problem and asked Jeong what was up. Was he sure the boss was dead? Or was it just pretending? Morgaine replied that it was definitely dead, especially since its body was all burnt up. However, before she could expound some more, a sudden stabbing sound sounded, drawing everyone's attention. When the duo turned to check, they were shocked to see a shadowy blade stabbed through the baddie. The culprit for his backstab was the Burnt Man, the second form of the Burning Man. The system described it as a being made of smoke, capable of growing and shrinking as it wished. Currently, its highest skill level was 1. The room instantly turned chaotic with Morgaine's ambush. The duo hadn't expected it to happen, so they were caught completely off guard. Unfortunately for them, the boss wasn't going to give them the time to adjust. It immediately shot out an attack aimed at Jeong. Jeong barely dodged the blow, narrowly saving his life. If he'd been late to open the second door, then he would have died for sure. His heart raced at the boss's absurd speed. How could it be that fast? Moreover, how was the attack still so powerful despite its crazy speed? It made no fucking sense. With how things were, Jeong suddenly smelled an intense stench of death. If he couldn't find an effective way to kill the boss bastard, then he would for sure die there. Worst part? He'd die in the company of the lizard bastard instead of a milfy mommy. What a trash way to go. Over at Lizard Mark, the dude chose the absolute worst time to get caught in his feels. He crouched before the dead Morgane, saying a bunch of sentimental nonsense to her. Well, technically, they weren't nonsense. In fact, they were actually pretty sweet. But come on, dude. Now isn't the time to say goodbye to bitches. Make some damn moves. The burnt man obviously wasn't going to let go of this opportunity. It swang at Lizard, going for a direct KO. Jeong saw this and immediately panicked. He shouted at Lizard to get his shit together. The baddie was already gone. Before he could convince the freak, the strike from B-Man landed, yeeting the absolute shit out of Morgane's corpse. As for Lizard, he'd narrowly escaped the attack, relying on some weird ass-pull move. The boss became more enraged after missing its attack. It decisively went all in, unleashing a flurry of strikes at Lizard. However, the ugly fool was still under the protection of plot armor, so he easily evaded the blows. As he ran, the scaly bastard took the chance to self-glaze a bit, flexing that he wouldn't die so easily. So what if the B-Man spanked his baddie? He'd make sure to get his revenge. In fact, his revenge arc would begin right now. He decisively lunged at the boss, his new skill on full display. Contrary to the lizard or salamander skills you might have expected, the fool actually had a cat skill, specifically, cat dance skill. The skill enabled fast and consecutive attacks and also buffed his physical abilities, so it wasn't that booty of a skill. Actually, it was pretty handy against the boss because it perfectly countered its incorporeal form. Every swing of Lizard's claws did fatal damage to the boss, dispersing its body bit by bit. Jeong saw this and immediately developed a battle strategy against the boss. If they could bombard it with quick, conservative attacks, then there was a chance they could win this fight easily. However, as expected of L.A.G, shit wouldn't go so easily. The boss suddenly switched up its fighting style, catching the duo off guard. Lizard was the first to feel this change, with a stab aimed at his head. Luckily, the weird fool was as nimble as a cat, allowing him to narrowly dodge the assault. Following his backflip, Lizard landed on the labyrinth wall before shooting back at the boss. The two continued their intense tango as the homie Jeong watched on from the sidelines. After observing for a while, Jeong gathered enough information to confidently join the fight. He first activated a movement technique, allowing him to glide seamlessly across the battlefield. He then summoned his bone blade before morphing it into a glaive. With the new weapon in tow, Jeong unleashed a flurry of stabs on the boss, slowly dispersing its body. On the other side, Lizard also joined the offensive, trapping the fiend in a pincer attack. Under the duo's relentless barrage, the boss finally scattered, leaving behind a faint shadow of itself. Jeong eyed the thin shadow and immediately frowned. Under normal circumstances, this would have been the time to receive the mission clear notification. But since nothing happened, it was safe to assume L.A.G was back at it again. He immediately locked in, ready for whatever shit would pop off. And as expected, the boss suddenly underwent a bizarre transformation, scaring the shit out of the duo. They rapidly backpedaled, moving away from the cluster of darkness that was the boss. However, halfway through the retreat, Lizard suddenly lost his damn mind and instead charged at the boss. He shouted a bunch of war cry bullshit, but honestly, I stopped listening because I knew this motherfucker was cooked. Jeong also felt the same way, so he silently watched on from the sidelines. And true to our prediction, just as Lizard was about to strike the boss, a new change occurred, leaving the fool in a perilous situation. Jeong picked up on this and shouted a warning to Lizard. Unfortunately, it was too late, and the die was already cast. When Lizard's attack landed, his eyes involuntarily widened, and an overwhelming feeling of dread assaulted him. He hadn't felt any feedback from his strike, meaning he hadn't hit the boss, but opened himself up for a brutal counterattack instead. Obviously, the boss wouldn't let go of such a prime opportunity. It instantly extended its shadowy tentacles, wrapping Lizard up in a cocoon of darkness. The cocoon then constricted before it slowly and painfully squeezed Lizard to death. With one final ghastly cry, the weird fool burst open like a ripe tomato, sputtering his blood across the labyrinth floor. Following his death, the dark cocoon settled into an unnerving silence as Jeong continued to watch from the sidelines. However, different from before, his face was now tensed, showing just how troubled he felt. He cursed Lizard for his rashness, openly blaming him for his current predicament. Didn't he know anything about L.A.G? How could he make such an amateur move this late into the game? Truly pathetic. Just as he was cursing Lizard to high hell, a new change occurred, drawing his attention. The darkness from the burnt man was slowly entering Lizard's corpse, promising one hell of a shit day. After a bit of time and under Jeong's tensed gaze, the possessed lizard slowly rose up, standing grandly before Jeong. Jeong gazed somberly at Lizard's abyss-like eyes before silently cursing to himself. He'd known this shit would happen, because when has Lag ever liked him? But even still, this wasn't enough to douse his spirit. He instantly locked in, opening the third door from the get-go. The possessed lizard also responded in kind, roaring out a sonic attack. The might of the blast caught Jeong slightly off guard, forcing him to backpedal. He held on with all his might before finally regaining his ground. When the roar faded, Jeong couldn't help but reassess the fiend. The casual attack was so powerful, it made Dwayne's beast roar seem like kids' play. However, if this attack was already so strong, just how broken was the boss? Not to mention its near indestructibility. How was he supposed to kill this thing? He had absolutely no idea. But still, that didn't stop him from trying. If he couldn't figure it out, then he'd just have to beat its ass until a solution appeared. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution. Thinking so, he decisively raised his glaive, ready to clap some possessed cheeks. With zero hesitation, he let that thing fly, unleashing the might of Asgard on its smoky ass. Unfortunately, even this wasn't enough, as not even Poppy Odin could exorcise this stubborn bastard. He easily tanked that shit, smirking at Jeong soon after. Jeong saw the smirk and cursed Lag. If even that attack didn't work, then what did the game want him to do? Did he have to get up close and personal? Fine. If that's what it took, then he'd personally deliver a can of whoop-ass on the fool. He charged forward, swinging his sword for a decapitating slash. But just like all his previous attempts, the slash amounted to booty, as Lizard easily blocked it. Jeong's eyes widened at the feat. Just how strong was this bastard to be able to block a sword with his bare hands? What kind of cheat-like skill was this? Obviously, his doubts went unanswered, and all he got was a killer punch to the gut. The blow was so severe that Jeong coughed up a mouthful of blood before being sent flying like a broken kite. As he closed in on the labyrinth wall, Jeong finally regained his senses and realized the immense danger he was in. If he clashed head-on at his current speed, then the impact would do even more damage than Lizard's punch. Such a thing couldn't be allowed to happen, thus he wisely channeled his acrobat-type shit, pulling off a mid-flight somersault. Thanks to his quick thinking, Jeong safely landed on the labyrinth wall, dispersing most of the momentum. With the quick second of respite, he quickly assessed the situation before realizing the boss wasn't all that strong. Sure, its physical abilities were absurd, but it wasn't to the point he couldn't endure it. And since that was the case, he quickly developed immense confidence in facing it in direct combat. He immediately lunged forward, clocking the boss in the jaw. Lizard responded with a nasty cross before eating Jeong's uppercut soon after. He instantly counterattacked with an uppercut of his own before winding back for a strong punch. Jeong did the same as the two titans clashed fists. The force from the blow kicked both of them back, forcing both parties to backtrack. Jeong quickly stabilized his body before shooting a glance at Lizard. What he saw made his scalp itch, as the bastard wasn't injured at all. Even after all that shit, the fool was still smirking, clearly enjoying the brawl. In fact, if he had to compare, he'd probably say he'd lost out on that exchange, with the only consolation being he'd managed to snatch Lizard's soul during the chaos. However, other than that, the situation wasn't looking too good, and if he couldn't turn things around, then he'd definitely die there. But even if he knew that, what could he possibly do? His stamina was already dangerously low, and the toll for using the third limitation door was already creeping in. If he wasn't careful, he might just die from the backlash before falling prey to the boss. With so many unfavorable factors, Jeong contemplated betting it all on madness. Since things had developed to that point, he might as well go mad and bring the bastard down with him. Unfortunately, even if he was suicidal, the madness skill was still on cooldown until his stamina recovered. If he wanted to use it, then he'd have to stall for 20 minutes at least. Jeong cursed at his dire circumstances but was helpless all the same. No matter how he thought about it, his only option was to fight, and fight some more. If he was lucky, then he might just fight his way to victory, or maybe a glorious death. In any case, his best move was to lock in and let them hooks fly. As he thought to this point, Jeong couldn't help but miss his crew. If they had been there, he wouldn't be going through this shit. At the very least, he might have used Dwayne as a meat shield as he escaped with his baddie Kara. What a fairy tale that would have been. Unfortunately, Lag wasn't a fairy tale, and Lizard wouldn't stay still and let him dream. He immediately lunged at him, forcing our boy to lock in. Jeong pushed the chaotic thoughts from his mind as he summoned his bone blade. Since things had gotten to this point, he might as well stab a bitch, and if even that isn't enough, he'd double down with a storm of lightning. He was really curious to see if the bastard was as indestructible as it seemed. Thus, Lizard was sent flying from the blow as Jeong watched on expectantly. However, after a quick glance, his face couldn't help but darken. The fool still had no injuries, and Jeong's attack seemed to be futile. He'd purposely aimed for the heart, but to think even that didn't work. Well, no shit. Did he forget the fool was already dead? Jeong watched on gravely before his expression suddenly changed. After careful observation, he realized that there was indeed a noteworthy change in Lizard's body. The black, smoky substance was slowly seeping from the stab wound. Not only that, the cocky fucker who'd been smirking the entire time was now showing a solemn and wary face. Jeong thought about it before coming to a realization. It seemed the boss's true motive for possessing Lizard was to get a meat shield to protect its weaker, smoky self. If that was true, then destroying the meat shield would enable him to kill the smoky bastard as well. After arriving at this conclusion, Jeong immediately set off to test it out. He first summoned his bone blade before morphing it into a serrated sword. If his guess was correct, then this would be the most efficient weapon to handle that possessed fool, since the edges would deal the most damage to the flesh. And to add a bit of spice to the mix, he summoned another serrated sword, dual-wielding them things. With that out of the way, Jeong immediately charged at the boss, ready to end this shit. He first opened with a right swing, aiming for a decapitating slash. However, Lizard easily dodged that shit, bending his back in unnatural arches. This move surprised Jeong, who hadn't expected the fiend to be that nimble. For a split second, he wondered if Lizard could teach that move to Kara, because who wouldn't want a baddie with a killer arch? However, he was soon pulled back to reality as a nasty punch aimed for his jaw. Jeong saw this and grit his teeth. Damn it, just how many L's was he going to take? Even if he was a patient Chad, this was still some bullshit. Jeong read the attack and narrowly dodged to the side. However, from that close shave with death, he knew this ugly, lizard-arched-back motherfucker couldn't be underestimated. If he wanted to actually survive this battle, then he had to throw all caution to the wind. Fuck defense. He was going all in with offense. He slashed at the fiend, sawing through its flesh with his serrated blade. When that wasn't enough, he headbutted the fool, forcing Lizard to stumble back. Lizard was taken aback by the sudden barrage. For a split second, he failed to react, causing him to take severe damage. Unfortunately for it, that split second was all Jeong needed to press the attack. He charged at the fiend, unleashing a flurry of slashes on it. Although each slash didn't do much damage, they quickly added up, forcing Lizard into a passive state. Jeong capitalized on this and doubled the assault, hoping to chip away at its life. But Lizard read through his intentions and counterattacked, grabbing and breaking Jeong's sword. Without the sword, Jeong immediately backpedaled. He'd be a fool if he insisted on attacking. Attacking such a foe without a weapon was pure lunacy. It'd be a miracle if he didn't get his ass clapped. Pause. Jeong ignored the narrator's sussy comment as he focused on the fiend. Although the ass clap made him think of Tai Min, he knew now wasn't the time for that shit. Ever since he dealt that sweet combo damage to the B-man, its aura had suddenly changed, almost as if it was cornered and desperate. Well, whatever the bastard had in store, Jeong was confident he could handle it somehow. So he dared the boss to come at him. Lizard said cool and spawned in front of Jeong, his fist already on his face. It moved with such speed that Jeong couldn't react, only letting out a soft bitchy whimper to express his shock. However, despite all that, he was still him. So he instinctively leaned forward, hoping to block with the toughest bone in the body. Obviously that didn't work out, and Jeong was yeeted to high heaven. In fact, the blow was so bad that Jeong was sent flying like a slapped hoe, crashing pathetically against the labyrinth wall. When he finally hit the ground, he couldn't help but look at the boss in shock. Where the fuck had all that strength come from? Had it been holding back this entire time? And if so, then this was truly some bullshit. If he compared his current strength to his past lives, then he'd say he had enough strength to rival the past him when he was on the 9th or maybe even 10th basement floor. That is to say, he was overpowered as fuck, but even so, this lizard bastard still sent him flying. How was that possible? Why was a boss this strong camping on the 6th floor? It made no sense. When he thought about it, Jeong inevitably doubted L.A.G. Could it be that the B-man was a trap by the game? Something that wasn't meant to be killed, just like the masked lion? Because if so, then it would make more sense. Unfortunately, he didn't have enough information to deduce the truth, and it wasn't like Lizard would idle around as he figured shit out. No matter the case, he still had to move. Only then would he have a slim chance to escape. He shakily stood up, only to collapse to his knees soon after. Coupled with his blurry vision and stinging head, Jeong realized his injuries were more severe than he'd initially thought. In fact, it was so bad that he couldn't control his body, essentially reduced to a sitting duck for the bee-man. Jeong grit his teeth and tried again, but no matter what he did, he still ended up on his knees, completely helpless. It was then that the sultry voice of death whispered into his ear. He was going to die. The next attack would kill him for sure. Jeong felt immense bitterness at the thought. Was this how he'd die? After everything he'd been through? Was he really going to die on his knees like a bitch, stepped on by this lizard bastard? Hell no. He'd be damned if he let that happen. Ever since the beginning, the system had promised a reward if the boss was killed. That meant it was definitely possible to clap this fool. If so, then why was he hesitating? Who better than him, Jeong the Big Poppy Hyeok, the MILF Slayer Hyeok, and the Maiden Conqueror Hyeok, could kill it? He immediately locked in, blocking Lizard's stomp with his arms. Through gritted teeth, he vowed to hold on, determined to fight until his last breath. Lizard stomped even harder at his defiance, resigned to extinguish that spark of rebellion in his eyes. Unbeknownst to them, the clash caused cracks on the floor, and the damage was only spreading as the fight continued. Before they could react, the ground suddenly collapsed, dragging both of them to the pits of hell. Well, maybe not hell, but it was still hella dark, so their fates weren't looking too good. After falling through the darkness for seemingly an eternity, Jeong suddenly crashed into a rocky desert, kicking up a dust storm from his pathetic landing. When the dust finally settled, the ragged silhouette of our boy became visible, and it was clear he'd seen better days. But even still, Jeong was happy he'd survived, and he thanked the sand for cushioning his fall. With that out of the way, he glanced around the room, marveled that such a place existed on the 6th basement floor. Unfortunately, his joy didn't last long as he soon caught a glimpse of Lizard. Of course the bastard had survived. This wouldn't be Lag if he didn't. Jeong grit his teeth as he cursed the resilient fucker. Why couldn't it fall on a rock or something? Why couldn't his luck be good for once? Well, to hell with it. If the fiend wanted smoke, then he'd give him smoke. Coincidentally, his butt had been itching lately, and he felt it was about time he pulled an ability out of his ass. He swiftly called upon his lightning, morphing it into a ball of carnage. With that as the base, he channeled more and more power to it, causing the lightning ball to balloon up in an instant. When the ball reached its limit, Jeong condensed it, forcing it to shrink to a regular-sized Chidori. Of course, this wasn't the real Chidori, but a Temu knockoff by the maidenless author. Jeong stared at the lightning ball as he reaffirmed his resolve. Although this was an impromptu ass pull, he still knew he couldn't be careless handling such a concentrated ball of energy. One wrong move, and it'd be off to Lag heaven for him. However, what choice did he have? If he didn't risk it, he would die for sure. Thus, he resolutely pushed the ball into his chest, allowing the lightning to run rampant in his body. Bolts of lightning streaked from his chest, bathing the surroundings in a storm of lightning. When the storm finally stopped, Jeong's silhouette became visible, and so did his new transformation. Official debut. Lightning Man just joined the fray. If you're curious about where the ability came from, just forget about it. The author explained with some bullshit, but I know ass-pull plot armor when I see it. Just forget it. It'll be simpler for everyone if you do. Over at Jeong, he mad-dogged Lizard, his battle lust brimming. With so much power coursing through him, he couldn't wait to clap some reptilian cheeks. He stared down the fiend, resolved not to die just yet. No matter the cost, he'd survive this hell, and hopefully, make it out with his crew. With his mind made up, Jeong locked all the fuck in. He channeled the lightning through his body, preparing for a devastating counterattack. The lightning flowed from his happy feet to his head through his chatty body. Buffed by the ass-pull technique, Maiden Hunter Jeong bravely faced off against Lizard, his intent to battle obvious. Lizard rose to the challenge, glaring back at Jeong. It then locked in before shooting straight at Jeong. Jeong was slightly startled by the attack, but he didn't lose his cool. He simply gathered his energy before zeroing in on Lizard. Thanks to his supercharged body, he could now follow the fiend's movements. All those absurdly fast attacks were mere trash in his eyes, Thus he easily swatted Lizard to the side, bitch slapping the shit out of the fool. Lizard was shocked by the sudden change, clearly confused by Jeong Bastard's power-up. However, despite the shock, it was still a boss. How could it falter because of a simple yeeting? It swiftly locked back in, prepared another attack, and lunged back at Jeong. Jeong read the attack and prepared a counter of his own. He crouched down before shooting at Lizard with a nasty Superman punch. Both titans clashed midway, causing a deafening explosion to sound. The force from the impact was so powerful that the surrounding space was sent into disarray, dust and wind clouds billowing about. Obviously, Lizard fell short in the exchange, causing it to fall back. In that short exchange, its arm was essentially crippled, leaving it in a perilous situation. Jeong noticed this and immediately prepared a counterattack. He wouldn't be the top dog if he didn't capitalize on such opportunities. Thus, he decisively shot at Lizard, ready to kick the fucker while he was down. Well, more like punch a fucker, based on the knuckled sandwich he just shoved into its face. Lizard quickly found itself in a perilous situation, cornered on all sides by the slayer Jeong. It shot through the air, obviously still reeling from the blow. Meanwhile, Jeong pressed the attack, gliding through the air like a Greek god. Without mercy, he delivered another savage punch, yeeting Lizard away like a broken kite. Capitalizing on this opening, Jeong shot forward again, recreating the iconic punch scene from Man of Steel. Just like the Chad Cal waifu stealer L, he clocked the shit out of Lizard, sending it flying like a rag doll. After the first punch came the second, then the third, and soon Lizard became a training dummy, punched to high hell for Jeong's satisfaction. When he finally saw an opening in Lizard's guard, Jeong rushed for it, delivering a nasty slam on the pitiful fool. Due to the absurd force, Lizard shot down like a comet, crashing pitifully on the desert floor. However, our boy wasn't done. He prepared another attack, this time going for a Thor-type shit, lightning punch. Buffed by the king of Asgard, Jeong crashed into Lizard, his fist digging deep into its gut. After the first punch came a second attack, a storm of lightning rampaging through Lizard's body. Jeong finally had enough and backpedaled. However, he soon jumped back in and resumed his offensive. Like a crazed beast, he let them fists fly, making sure the fiend was dead for good. After a session of pure carnage, he reluctantly fell back, leaving the mangled corpse for the desert to devour. Jeong eyed his handiwork in satisfaction, but deep down, he still felt like shit. He already knew the backlash would be strong, but he'd never imagined it would be this severe. In fact, it was so bad that his body was useless, drained of energy to even lift a finger. Well, even if that was the case, he was still glad he went through with it. Because of the OP move, he'd managed to get rid of the boss, and that was a worthwhile trade in his books. Just as he was glazing himself, a sudden change occurred before him, catching him completely off guard. Lizard, the same fool that had its body torn to bits, was slowly rising, an action that greatly shocked Jeong. He wondered how the fool was still alive, especially since he'd personally torn it to shreds. Unfortunately, the boss wouldn't answer, and it wasn't like his denial would change anything. Thus, he swiftly locked in, glaring daggers at the approaching Lizard. Lizard calmly walked toward Jeong, causing the latter to frown intensely. Because of the backlash, his body was still immobilized, so he couldn't muster a resistance even if he wanted to. He stared gravely at Lizard, powerless to stop his demise. Lizard inched closer to Jeong, its arm raised to attack. Because of Jeong's condition, the bastard was essentially powerless, a fat fish on the chopping board. Without giving the fish any chance to counterattack, Lizard punched forward, aiming for Jeong's heart. Jeong's face instantly paled, dreading that his end had finally come. But contrary to his expectations, Lizard suddenly stopped, its fist passing harmlessly through Jeong's body. Jeong stared in surprise at the slowly dissipating bee-man, puzzled as to what was going on. Even if it was plot armor, wasn't this a bit too much? He shot a questioning glance at Not, but the chatty narrator told him to just go with it. Why was he questioning blessings? Who knows? Maybe his next armor would be some bitches, and he'd finally get himself some waifus. Until then, he should pay attention to the system notification, as it had some news to deliver. It stated that the additional mission for room B64 had been completed, and the owner of the labyrinth had been killed. As things stood, only one mission was left, and that was to escape that hell. Jeong locked all the fuck in, knowing the true challenge had just begun. Escape aside, his main priority was to find his crew and, more importantly, reunite with his baddie. Hopefully this time, the author would have some mercy and his baddie would still be alive, because otherwise, fuck that dude. As he was thinking of his future moves, the mist that was formerly the B-Man fully dissipated, leaving behind a brand new shade of souls. I'm colorblind as fuck, so I won't even attempt identifying the color. However, the important thing to note is that B-Man was hella strong, so the soul it left behind must be juicy as well. Jeong smiled at the loot, but the surprises didn't end there. Just as it had promised, a gift was granted by the system for the courageous players who killed the owner of the labyrinth. For our boy, the gift manifested as a swirling black vortex which promptly shot at him. Just as Jeong was beginning to freak out and fear for his body being probed by some black misty tentacles, the mist suddenly changed direction and settled on his right arm. Jeong sighed in relief before shifting his focus to his right arm. On it was the system's gift, which it described as the gray body skill. The skill basically allowed for partial transformation, and the effect extended to skills as well. Although Jeong felt uneasy about it, he still accepted the skill. Because what else could he do? On top of that, it was his experience that skills and effects were generally harmless to the users, so that at least gave him some confidence. However, just because that was the case didn't mean it was still true. This was lag after all, so he wouldn't be surprised if the game switched things up just to mess with him. He decided to test things out. Only then would he be truly secure. The first test involved the Bone Blade, which transformed from an equipment skill into a passive skill. Due to the change, the skill became permanently his, and its ease of use increased drastically. He could now summon and morph the Bone Blade at will, making the skill more versatile and deadly. Unfortunately, with every upside, there's a downside, and in this case the Skeleton Soldier skill was permanently removed, canceling his access to it. Although it was a shame, Jeong quickly got over it because the next upgrade was just that great. The Skull King's face successfully upgraded to the Skull King passive skill. The skill served as a permanent buff, strengthening Jeong's bones to a ridiculous degree. And yes, I mean all the bones. From his arms, to his legs, and of course, his boner. Let's move on, shall we? Due to the buff, Jeong's defense had also strengthened significantly, increasing his chances of survival. And although I'm not sure, I believe he now has what it takes to fight evenly against Stepan, or at the very least not lose so pathetically. That in itself should tell you just how much he'd leveled up. However, Jeong still had a lot on his mind, which sucked the joy from the moment. He was really worried about the crew. Were they still alive? Did they manage to escape the labyrinth? He didn't know, and that uncertainty was driving him crazy. He thought about it for a while before sighing in defeat. There wasn't anything he could do. He just hoped they were alive, and that they'd reunite soon enough. Shaking the turbulent thoughts from his mind, Jeong looked around the space. He was still hella tired, so finding a place to hide was of utmost importance. Second to that was avoiding any conflict, as fighting in his current condition would just lead him to death. Thus, he shakily walked forward, nesting himself in a secluded spot amidst the desert rocks. When he settled down, his eyes drooped immediately, too tired to stay awake. Soon, his gentle snores sounded, serenading the calm desert. After an unknown period of time, Jeong finally stirred from his slumber, fully ready to re-embark on his journey. However, that's when he discovered an unforeseen problem. He had no idea where to go. All around him was an unfamiliar desert, so where the hell was he supposed to go? Left with no choice, Jeong picked a random direction and just walked. Whether he was right or not, he'd figure out later. For now, all he could do was move. After walking for hours, the intense heat of the desert finally got to him, and Jeong couldn't help but pant heavily. However, even though he was tired, he still continued walking, since stopping would only lead to his death. He knew for a fact there was an end to the desert, so he just kept walking, even though his efforts were proving more and more futile. Luckily, after an eternity of suffering, and just when he was about to collapse, things finally turned around, and Jeong finally saw some hope. Before him was a huge hole, or rather, quicksand, the only oddity in the otherwise monotonous desert. Jeong quickly identified it as the entrance to the next floor, as nothing else seemed to fit the description better. On top of that, he'd also run into such kinds of entrances in his past lives, so he was pretty sure this was the real deal. Probably. Wasting no time, Jeong swiftly took a deep breath before jumping into the quicksand. When he did, he thanked his lucky stars he'd taken the gamble, because this was indeed the correct entrance to the next floor. Beneath him was a giant hole, the kind you'd associate with typical entrances in L.A.G, and further down was a dim light, likely the light from the next floor. Jeong grew more brazen and further increased his falling speed. Soon, he tore through the ceiling, officially crashing into the next floor. When the dust settled, he was shocked to realize the ceiling was made of sand. As for how it stayed in place and didn't fall, he had no idea, and just chalked it up to L.A.G being L.A.G. That aside, he also noticed another interesting detail. He wasn't the only one in the room. All around him were groups of people, each more tense than the last. For some strange reason, he was getting a really bad feeling about the room. Just as he was taking in the scene, a ninja baddie suddenly screamed, crying out for her beloved. However, no matter what she did, the homie still died, leaving her alone in the hellish game. The baddie's comrade called out to her, urging her to forget about him. Inasmuch as it sucked, the Chad was already gone, so crying about it wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he begged her to lock in, because if she didn't, then they would all die there. Jeong heard the bootleg Assassin's Creed and immediately became puzzled. He realized the Humpty Dumpty wasn't referring to him or the other group, so what the hell was going on? As he was still racking his brain for a solution, a gigantic explosion sounded behind him, scaring the shit out of him. Jeong swiftly turned to check, and what he saw terrified him. Throughout his experiences in L.A.G, this was the first time he felt justified to curse. And truly, L.A.G was on some bullshit. Honestly, what the hell is this shit? Before him was a giant antlion with a fat ass. The system described it as basically immortal because the bastard wouldn't die even if it was killed. Obviously, Jeong had the same reaction as most of you right now. What the hell was that shit? First, it was ridiculously OP bosses, and now the boss was immortal? What was going on with L.A.G? Unfortunately, he didn't have the time to curse at L.A.G because the monster was there, and he had to lock in. Over at the main battlefield, the bootleg Assassin's Creed and Widow baddie did their best to hold the creature back. Although their attacks were pure garbage, they still did a good enough job to buy time for the bronze and possibly bootleg Garcia mommy. Capitalizing on the opening they bought, she lunged at the thick ant, her bone blade drawn for a desperate attack. Jeong noticed the baddie and couldn't help but be pleasantly surprised. Not only was she a bootleg version of his lost boo Emma, top waifu Garcia, but she was also quite formidable, as shown by her courage to face the abominable monster head-on. Unfortunately, in L.A.G, courage and milfiness weren't enough to fell monsters. Strength was also needed. Just as he'd expected, the baddie's attack bounced off the creature's carapace, doing 0 damage. Forget about the big bastard. Even little insects have a thick exoskeleton, not to mention this undying fucker. So her attack failing was all but certain to Jeong. Back at the battlefield, Bronze Emma suddenly sensed an immense premonition of death and rapidly backpedaled. Luckily, she did so, as the antlion dove back into the ground immediately after. If she'd insisted on her attack, then she would have been dragged in as well, and that would have been an instant death sentence. After losing sight of the boss, the whole group grew frantic, and desperate cries rang out, which low-key surprised Jeong. He wondered why they were acting like that, but his question was soon answered by a sneak attack from the antlion. It turned out the creature was using the dense sand to pick them off one by one, and every dive into the ground signaled the death of another player. Currently, the unlucky bastard was the homie Vincent, who got torn in two, much to the group's horror. Jeong noticed this and frowned slightly. From his observation, he could deduce that both the players and the antlion had their own strategies. The players were probably trying a scheme to trap the creature, but that was obviously not going to work. That was because the boss had seen through their strategy and was using their own tactics to pick them off one by one. To fully trap it, the players had to be spread out, and the antlion was using that chance to deal with the players individually as opposed to dealing with them in a group. Just like in the current moment where the boss had its sights set on new prey, and the others couldn't rush in to help. Jeong watched as the fool panicked before being yeeted to high hell by the antlion. Just as he'd expected, the others didn't move to help. First, it went against their strategy, and second, who would be dumb enough to risk their lives to save others? It wasn't like they had enough of those to throw around. Thus, they all watched passively as the new prey died, clearly not intending to intervene. Well, all but one. The bootleg Garcia suddenly spawned beside the boss, delivering a nasty slash to its carapace. When the first slash didn't work, she immediately went to town on the bastard, landing a flurry of attacks on its back. Thanks to her relentless barrage, the carapace finally showed signs of collapsing, giving hope to the players. Unfortunately, this hope was short-lived, as the boss retaliated, charging forward to squash her against a looming boulder. Just as despair was sinking in, a comrade came to her rescue, bashing the boss and buying Bronze Baddie enough time to escape. Because of the timely assist, the bootleg Garcia got to live another day, and she sincerely thanked the player who low-key looked a bit like a thinner Dwayne. Or maybe Dwayne on crack, depending on how you look at it. Jeong chose that moment to finally join the fray. He expressed his willingness to help, so what did the group want the mighty him to do? Crackhead Dwayne replied that they needed help with the carapace. Without destroying that thing, they wouldn't be able to do shit to the boss. Bronze Garcia, who turns out to be Carly, added that they needed to make a hole in the carapace. Only then would they be able to finish it off with magic. Jeong doubted their idea but still went with it. Even though he knew killing an immortal being wasn't so easy, what other choice did he have? This was L.A.G. The missions had to be cleared even if he had to toot that ass to do so. Pause. Just as they were ironing out the plan, the boss suddenly attacked, forcing the group to disperse. They all skedaddled, all except Jeong, who stayed in place to farm some aura. Like the maiden slayer he was, Jeong stayed rooted in place, glaring at the boss with unmatched confidence. The boss responded to the challenge, doubled its speed, and rammed into him like Track-kun from those generic isekai stories. However, unlike those brain rot stories, our boy was genuinely him, so he easily dodged that shit, clinging to the wall with his Batman skill. Realizing the baddie Carly had her eyes set on him, Jeong decided to flex some more, lunging at the boss with unmasked ferocity. He first morphed his bone blade into a spear, perfect for poking a bastard with. The stab dug so deep that the boss couldn't help but shriek in pain, its immortality be damned. It instantly realized its perilous situation and opted to temporarily retreat into the sand. Obviously, the group wouldn't let this happen. The first to move was Crackhead Dwayne, who snorted a bump before clinging to the boss's leg. Thanks to his mysterious yet crystallized power-up, he managed to hold on to the boss, preventing it from retreating into the sand. Next was Assassin's Creed, who used his powers to stall for even more time. Although we don't get to see the visual manifestation of his power, I'm pretty sure he was really doing something. Otherwise, he wouldn't be bitching so much. He cried out to the group, urging them to hurry, as he wouldn't be able to hold it for long. First of all, that's what he said. Second of all, if you really think about it, 10 seconds is like a minute in dog time. So don't let her tell you shit, kings. Keep doing your thing. Jeong heard the narrator's nonsense ramblings and told not to focus. Now wasn't the time to get lost in his down-bad thoughts. Not understood, but honestly, the translators left him no other choice. What did they mean by the gap is too narrow and he needs to widen it? Wasn't this just asking to be teased? Especially with how pervy he was? In any case, he decided to lock in as well since Jeong still needed his narration for the upcoming battle. Speaking of Jeong, he decided to morph his bone blade once again. Since the spear wasn't thick enough to widen the gap, he opted for a broadsword, one wide enough to get the job done. However, as typical of L.A.G, things wouldn't go so smoothly. Just as he was preparing to land the final blow, the boss suddenly launched a counterattack, catching him completely off guard. In that short prelude to death, Jeong was forced to make a quick decision. Continue and risk death, or fall back and lose the golden opportunity. The choice was up to him. Jeong thought about it for only a second before saying, "Fuck that." There was no way in hell he'd risk his life so casually. He shouted at the group to help, otherwise he'd drop that shit and bounce. Tanned Garcia responded to his request, charging forward to reinforce him. On the opposite side, the grieving baddie, who I'll call White Widow from now on, also did the same, her face tinged with determination. Apart from them, there was also the bootleg Assassin's Creed, who for some reason became emo all of a sudden. I wonder where he got the black eyeliner and lipstick. In any case, the three did their best to reinforce Jeong. And yes, I said three, because Crackhead Dwayne stupidly got himself killed, stabbed through by the antlion's leg. Because of his foolish death, the antlion got enough leeway to retaliate, and it didn't hesitate to unleash its fury on Assassin's Creed. It yeeted him to the side like a rag doll, causing the poor emo to crash pathetically against the cave wall. Jeong saw this and immediately tensed up. With two players out of commission, things had suddenly become more difficult. As if proving him right, the antlion launched another sneak attack, this time attacking from a seemingly impossible angle. Jeong felt the threat and instantly dodged, narrowly escaping a quick kiss with death. If he'd hesitated for even a second, then he would have been another meat skewer on the battlefield, dying as pathetically as crackhead Dwayne. As he was thanking his lucky stars, Jeong noticed something that made his frown deepen. The wound on the boss's back was closing. In fact, the healing speed was so fast that Jeong couldn't believe just how much of a cheat it was. Was this what the system meant by it being immortal? Because if so, then he kinda got it now. However, just because he understood it didn't mean he'd let it happen. He'd be damned if he let lag have its way. Thus, he rapidly shot toward the boss, opening the first limitation door in the process. When he deemed that insufficient to deal with the boss, he added on the lightning effect, zapping the shit out of the boss. Bronze Baddie took that chance to attack as well, closing in on the boss with her bone blade. Thanks to Jeong's efforts, the boss's wound wasn't completely healed yet, so the baddie simply jammed her blade into it. After managing to keep the wound open, Carly turned to White Widow, urging her to make her move. White Widow didn't disappoint. Although she was still grieving her beloved, she knew a new hunk was already in sight, so it was time she forgot that loser. If she wanted to impress the MILF hunter Jeong, then she had to give it her all. She channeled her fire skill, shooting it at the boss soon after. As the flame flew, it morphed into a serpentine form, which quickly slithered into the boss's guts. Jeong and Carly immediately backpedaled, having no desire to get caught up in the ensuing explosions. As expected, the carnage was grand, making their choice to retreat the correct one. Devastating explosions rang out across the boss's body, reducing it to a fiery mess. Of course, the fiend didn't take this lying down. It immediately retaliated, swatting Carly away like a bug. The tanned baddie was caught completely off guard, causing her to black out immediately. With her neutralized, the battlefield instantly became more dangerous, adding more pressure to Jeong and White Widow. Speaking of Jeong, he finally made his move, closing the gap between himself and the fiend. His plan was simple. Kill the boss before Lag did the Lag thing and crashed out again. Coincidentally, the boss had its sights set on Carly and White Widow, which made his ambush all the better. On one hand, he could kill the biggest threat in the room, effectively saving his own life. And on the other hand, he could save two damsels in distress. Who knows how they'd reward him? Probably with some cheeks. In any case, the game plan was set. He had to clap some ant cakes. Jeong rushed forward before lunging at the bone blade on the boss's carapace. With that in his grasp, he instantly opened the third limitation door, buffing his body for the havoc to come. Wasting no time, he channeled his lightning storm, bathing the fiend in its zapping brilliance. Due to the devastating attack, the boss's body fell apart like dominoes, crumbling to pieces under its relentless barrage. Soon, the fiend met its end, with its head popping off like a ripe tomato. Jeong saw this and wisely deactivated his limitation form. As much as he wanted to continue zapping this bastard, he knew such acts were pointless, and it would only put him in danger. Instead, he shifted his attention to the baddies, curious to know how they were doing. White Widow replied that they were good, thanks to him. However, since they were already talking, she might as well apologize in advance. Jeong eyed her curiously before asking what she was talking about. Why was she apologizing to him? Before he could get an answer, the sand suddenly attacked, wrapping around him like a cocoon. In that split second, an idea popped into his mind, and he immediately knew what was going on. This was a double cross. He'd been betrayed by these treacherous bitches. Damn. Jeong glanced behind him, and just as he'd expected, Assassin Creed was in on the backstab as well. Despite the seemingly dangerous situation he was in, he still remained relatively calm, as if this wasn't that big of a deal. With his calm demeanor still evident, he turned to face the baddies, inquiring if they were sure about this. Did they really want this smoke? White Widow replied that they didn't, but they had no other option. Tanned Garcia added that this was their strategy. For weaklings like them to survive in Lag, they had no choice but to hunt the strong. It was the only way to survive. He seemed strong, so he must know what kind of hell Lag is. Without taking such risks, how could they grow strong enough to survive? Jeong stared at the treacherous bitches but didn't say anything. Words were useless at that point. The baddies had already made their choice, so talking to them was just a waste of time. Carly noticed his patient acceptance and stepped forward. She believed this was Jeong's way of accepting his fate, probably because he knew he couldn't escape anyway. She gazed at the Chad sadly before sighing in resolution. It had to be done, even if she didn't want to. However, because he was a handsome and chatty poppy, she'd try to make it as painless as possible. There wasn't a need for such a fine specimen to suffer. With that in mind, she stabbed at Jeong, landing a direct hit on his chest. When the strike landed, Carly couldn't help but recoil in shock. What the hell was going on? The stab had done 0 damage to Jeong, even failing to pierce his skin. She suddenly had a bad premonition warning her to watch out. However, before she could react, Jeong flexed his lightning, easily breaking out of the sand cocoon. Now free, Jeong glared at the treacherous wenches. He let them know he didn't blame them, because he too had done the same in the past. And just like them, his ending was also quite tragic. But just because he understood them didn't mean he'd forgive them. They'd tried to kill him, so it was only right if he killed them as well. Saying so, Jeong opened the second door of limitation, ready for battle. As he was preparing to clap some cheeks, Emo Creed lunged from behind, attempting a sneak attack. He decisively launched his strongest attack, hoping to kill Jeong on the spot. Unfortunately for him, Jeong easily blocked that shit, using his lightning to counter the sand skill. Before the bastard could react, he responded with a left jab aimed at his flank. Creed noticed the attack and hurriedly erected a shield to block. Although the skill wouldn't hold for long, it was still enough for him to launch an attack of his own. However, Jeong read through this attack as well, blocking it with relative ease. This time, he opted for a forehead block, causing significant damage to Creed's arm. Just as he was about to finish him off, the ladies finally intervened with a blazing serpent hurling straight at him. Jeong ate the attack, forcing him to backpedal quite a bit. With the explosion's smoke still blocking his vision, Carly spawned behind him, attempting another sneak attack. However, this time Jeong was ready. He silently blocked the baddie's strike, stabbing into her gut in the process. Carly recoiled from the pain, nursing her wound as she backtracked from Jeong. Before he could press the attack, Creed appeared behind him again, going for a lethal blow. This time, Jeong had had enough and savagely grabbed him by the face. He lifted the fucker into the air before slamming him hard onto the ground. Ignoring Creed's pathetic chokes and sobs, he proceeded to zap the shit out of him, reducing his face to a burnt crisp. Done with that, he calmly turned to face the baddies. What would they do now? Would they fight or nah? Carly told him not to fuck with them. Ever since the beginning, they were ready to risk their lives. In fact, with Creed's death, that determination only strengthened, so there was nothing left to discuss. She told Jeong to come at them. They were ready to see this through till the end. With that, the duo charged at Jeong, causing a devastating explosion from their clash. A short while later, the room finally regained its calm, indicating the end of the battle. Left standing was the homie Jeong, who silently deactivated his limitation form. Although he'd just been through a battle, he didn't seem fazed at all, almost as if it was nothing. The only clue to the big clash was the blood on his blade and the dead corpses on the floor, both mangled to some degree. Jeong stared at the baddies, but he didn't seem bothered in the slightest. This was L.A.G. Such occurrences were common in that hell. If it had been the other way around, he was sure the wenches wouldn't have hesitated, so there was no need to feel sorry about it. He calmly collected their souls, using their power to level up his skills. He leveled up Tough Skin from level 20 to level 30, significantly increasing his defense. On top of that, when Tough Skin leveled up, it influenced the Bone Weapon skill, making it level up to Bone Equipment passive skill. With that out of the way, Jeong contemplated leveling up his Calm Breathing skill, but decided against it for now. Although the upgrade would make several skills easier to use, he didn't have enough souls to do so, so he put it aside for now. Besides, there were still several aspects of the calm breathing he hadn't tried out yet, like breath holding, so he wasn't in a rush to advance. Finished with his looting, Jeong turned to the nearby door, probably the entrance to the next floor. Wasting no time, he entered through the door, finding himself in an empty corridor. After walking for a bit, he finally reached his destination, the official entrance to the 7th floor. Jeong eyed the door before resolutely heading inside. What was there to fear anyway? When the door closed behind him, Jeong found himself in quite a pickle. If he were to describe it, he'd say something like doors, or rather, hella doors, judging by how many there were. All around him were identical doors, all clustered neatly along the room's walls. And the worst part? He had no idea what to do about it. Jeong took in the bizarre scene and couldn't help but feel a headache creeping up. Damn, this was going to be a bitch to handle. After some thought, Jeong decided to analyze the room some more. He quickly discovered that this was the first time he was seeing such a scene in L.A.G. But from his ample experience, it wasn't hard to deduce what was going on. Every door in the room led to a different space on the 6th floor. That is to say, every door led to a poor fool currently being clapped, choked, and possibly probed in a mission right now. Although it was hilarious to think about, especially if you imagine them getting the Thai-Min treatment, hella backshots, now wasn't the time for that, and the system wholeheartedly agreed. It immediately issued a prompt announcing that the mission was complete. Just as it had promised, juicy rewards were given to our boy, specifically 100 souls and the labyrinth key. It also emphasized that the rewards were given to him, Lee MILF Slayer Hyeok. Anyone who completed the mission first, or those who'd complete it later, would be rewarded at their own time. For those with big brains, I'm sure you must have already guessed what that means. If you haven't, then I guess we can only say God can't give you everything. You must be a Chad or baddie as compensation for falling short in that regard. However, if you're lacking both, then I'm sorry. You're cooked. Anyway, taunting aside, the system also gave more details about the labyrinth key. It was essentially a cheat item, one that can be used to open anything, and yes, I said anything, talk about being broken. The only downside was that the key could only be used 7 times, after which it would be destroyed. But even still, it was a great reward. Moving on, Jeong quickly stored the key. When he did, a hidden compartment in the floor opened up, offering an exit to the room. Jeong immediately walked over. He realized that it was a hole, a bottomless hole. In fact, despite his owl eyes, he still couldn't pierce the darkness and see the bottom. On top of that, a cold, ghastly wind blew in the hole, making it even more ominous. Jeong thought about it for a second, debating whether he should really go down such a spooky hole. However, after much thought, he instantly jumped into the hole. Why, you might ask? Well, first, he's not a bitch. And second, if it's a matter of bottomless hose, sorry, I meant holes, then he has enough experience with your trashy ex. Why would he be afraid of something like this? He swiftly dove down the shaft, recreating the horrible Temu flying CGI. Halfway through the fall, Jeong's mind couldn't help but wander. He recalled his past regressions and noted that the 7th floor was where he died the most. In fact, it wasn't an exaggeration to say that his cheeks got polished the most on the 7th floor than everywhere else in L.A.G. Although he doesn't go into much detail about it, the slight tremble in his body told us everything we needed to know. This motherfucker is cooked. Deciding to ignore the dread for now, Jeong immediately locked in. He first glided down the walls, reducing his speed by a lot. When he was satisfied, he leaped off the wall, landing gracefully on the ground. Just like that, Jeong had arrived at his destination, and the system also stated as much. It issued a prompt welcoming the MILF synthesizer to the 7th floor. Jeong ignored the prompt and stared forward in shock. Before him was a silhouette he'd never thought he'd run into here. Who else could it be but the main unit Dwayne? Forget the budget, Temu, crackhead version from before. This one was the real deal, including his CHADY aura. Jeong instantly called out to him, drawing Dwayne from his banter. When the unit realized it was Jeong calling, his face couldn't help but brighten. He shouted Jeong's name in response, running to him like a lost maiden. Just when I thought the duo were about to take us back to Brokeback Mountain, Jeong reached out his hand and told Dwayne to hold it. This wasn't that kind of video. If he really wanted that kind of action, then he should at least start by buying Terry Crews bathwater. Before that, he should keep it PG for the Chads. Ignoring Not's wild banter, Jeong turned his attention to the other figure in the room. He identified him as someone he'd known in his past life, but that in itself wasn't a good thing. To be able to make an impression on a regressor in a hellish place like L.A.G., the individual had to be famous or infamous, and for this bastard it was the latter. Jeong recalled meeting him, and his impression was that the dude was batshit crazy. In fact, he was so insane that Jeong had to act personally and kill his ass. Pause. In any case, this wasn't a good development. However, after thinking about it more, Jeong realized that might not necessarily be the case. Both Stepan and Maytal had changed in this regression, so who's to say this crazy bastard hadn't as well? For now, he opted to play it safe and keep an eye on him. Done with that, Jeong gazed around the room, clearly searching for someone. When his search proved futile, he directly asked Dwayne where Kara was. Why hadn't she come to welcome her poppy? Dwayne's face instantly fell with the question. He hesitantly replied that he didn't know either. They'd been separated on the last floor. Jeong's eyes widened in shock. What did he mean? Dwayne explained that after he'd left, a scary bastard ambushed them, forcing them into the lightning cloud. Although they tried to fight back, all their attacks didn't do shit, leaving them in a perilous situation. Cornered and with no other choice, he'd drawn the fiend's aggro, hoping to buy time for Kara to escape. Luckily, that part of the plan worked, and the fiend chased after him. Jeong immediately asked how he'd survived. If their attacks really did no damage to the creature, then how did he survive? Dwayne replied that he was just as clueless as he was. After drawing the creature away, he'd run like crazy. During the frantic escape, he'd occasionally turn and let loose his beast roar, buying himself more time. After a series of back and forths and the obvious close shaves, the bastard suddenly stopped, retreating on his own accord. When he confirmed he was safe, he hurried back to where he'd left Kara, but found she wasn't there anymore. He had no idea where she was currently. Jeong heard his recount and sighed softly. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing. In L.A.G, not finding a corpse can be considered a good outcome. Who knows? Maybe the baddie was out there somewhere waiting for them to rescue her. Just as he was contemplating his next move, the crazy bastard joined the banter, asking to be introduced. He was Norman Miles, and apart from his absurd highest skill level, his other stat was pure booty. Seriously, what the hell are you supposed to do with prickly skin? Was this a troll from L.A.G or what? Dwayne snapped to his senses and introduced the two. Since names were already shown by the system, he didn't need to dwell too much on that. Instead, he focused on how he'd met each party. For Norman, he explained that he'd run into him while looking for Kara. He expressed that Norman was a chill guy, and their teamwork was great. That's how they managed to survive until now. For Jeong, he didn't say much, but we can all guess what he would have said. Certified Poppy, Supreme MILF Slayer, and of course, he was him. It's not that difficult to describe our boy. If it wasn't for the author hating on him and the mommies in the story, then that list might have been longer. Probably without the chairman of the Virgin Association tag. In any case, let's shift back to the story and forget Jeong's maidenless life. After the introduction, it was time to select a door to challenge. With so many options, both Dwayne and Norman were quite stumped. Jeong, however, had other things in mind. He was certain this was the same trial as his past regressions, which also meant they were all the way fucked. But obviously, he wouldn't tell the duo that. Making them panic wasn't a smart move. Just as he was about to voice his opinion, Norman beat him to it and suggested taking door B755. Dwayne asked why that door specifically, but Norman shrugged it off, saying it was just a hunch. Obviously, Dwayne wasn't convinced by this, so he turned to face Jeong. What did he think? Jeong replied that it didn't matter. It would be the same in the end anyway. Inwardly, he mused about his experiences in L.A.G and the things that left the deepest impressions on him. One of them, unfortunately, was the 7th floor and the 7 doors it contained. It was always the same, and obviously the horrors were equally as constant. He explained to the duo that the doors were connected, and the goal of the room was to clear all the doors. Thus, it didn't matter what door they chose because they would enter all of them anyway. Norman asked how he knew that, and Jeong replied that it was his private attribute, not giving any details after that. Norman quickly got the hint and stopped prying. Instead, he asked Jeong what they should do. Jeong replied that they'd enter the doors, but in order. His explanation was that the doors had different difficulties, so it was best to tackle them from the easiest to the hardest. That way they'll have more leeway in the fights. The duo quickly agreed. It wasn't like they had any better ideas anyway. Thus, the trio promptly entered their first door, B711. What greeted them was a surreal scene, a room covered in calming blue, an obvious oddity in the hell that was L.A.G. If it wasn't for their rich experience, they might have fallen for the trap and assumed they were safe. Luckily, they weren't that naive, and the system prompt also helped them snap out of that foolish mindset. It explained the details of the room, but it's mostly everything Jeong had said, so don't worry about it. The only new info was the rewards, and the system promised quite the haul. First was 200 souls, next was an equipment exchange coin, and finally was a random skill exchange coin. It went without saying that the system was quite generous this time, which could only mean the room was about to violate our boys in all the wrong ways. Major pause. Apart from the main mission, the room also had a side mission, specifically to defeat the boss in every room. If they did that, then they'd get an additional reward. The clueless duo read through the prompts and commented indifferently. They deemed the mission quite simple, provided they were lucky and didn't fuck up. Jeong didn't reply, almost as if he couldn't be bothered with their naive words. Just as the duo were about to ask him what's up and where the boss was, a summoning circle suddenly shone from up ahead, drawing their attention. From the circle, aqua blobs of water slowly coalesced, obviously shaping into a new terror. Jeong's face instantly became solemn. He told the Chads to lock in because shit was finally about to go down. True to his prediction, the coalesced water slowly started to take form. Much to the trio's shock, the water first morphed into a wicked beard before completing the body of the dreaded boss. From an outward appearance, it wasn't that menacing. Just the typical forms we've grown to expect in L.A.G. In fact, with that potbelly and literal dicklessness, I'd say this is the sloppiest and saddest boss design I've seen in L.A.G. so far. And it's not just me thinking so, even the system threw shots at the fool, further emphasizing its L. It introduced him as Laggard the Dickless. Okay, maybe just Laggard. I added the dickless part myself. Anyway, its public attribute described it as extremely lazy, though not slow in the slightest. Currently, its highest skill level was 45. At first, I was puzzled as to why the fool was catching so many strays. I mean, being ugly and dickless was already bad enough, so why did the system have to call him lazy? But then I saw his nose, and I gotta say, this motherfucker deserves it. Just what in the eye show speed is that? Jeong also saw the beast, and his expression turned serious. However, contrary to my wilding thoughts, his attention was on something else. Laggard, this willyless fool, was different from his past regressions. And as a consequence, he had no idea how to deal with the pot-bellied, broad-nosed freak. As he was contemplating his next actions, the oblivious duo called out to him, asking what they should do next. Jeong replied that he had no idea. It wasn't like he knew everything. Norman glanced at him suspiciously. What did he mean he didn't know? Didn't his private attribute tell him? Or was it that the info he received wasn't as detailed as he'd initially believed? Well, if that was the case, then his attribute balance was pure garbage. The demerits of only having 2 active skills couldn't balance out the merits of receiving occasional info about the rooms. The balance was just off, and if he were to be honest, he'd probably say L.A.G. screwed him over. However, despite believing so, Norman still felt something wasn't right. He highly believed Jeong was hiding something. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. The only concern was, did Dwayne know about this, or had he been successfully fooled by Jeong as well? If it was the latter, then he should immediately abandon this group, because there was no way he'd trust his life to a liar and a fool. Shelving his doubts for now, Norman noticed another bizarre scene. Laggard seemed to be rooted in place. Even with enemies before it, the fool still didn't budge, a complete opposite to the monsters they'd run into so far. Jeong thought about it before instructing the duo to approach it. If Laggard didn't want to move, then they'd just go to him. Thus, the trio walked forward, decisive in their steps. Halfway through the walk, the fiend still stared at them passively, almost as if it had no intentions to respond. However, when they crossed the 3/4 mark, it finally lost its cool and whispered to them. It called them troublesome. Much to the trio's puzzlement, the boss proceeded to go on a long rant, explaining how troublesome it was. They were troublesome, the room was troublesome, and even L.A.G. was troublesome. If only he could melt and disappear, how great would that be? Why did his life have to be so troublesome? As he was complaining his guts out, he suddenly realized that even thinking about it was troublesome. Not only that, talking about it was even more troublesome. Then what should he do? It was simple. He'd just stop talking and thinking. That way, it would be less troublesome. If you haven't noticed already, Laggard has a tendency of finding things troublesome. It was hinted at on his character profile, and I guess this is the author's way of expressing his extreme laziness. Anyway, since it had decided to stop thinking and talking, Laggard settled for observing once again. He neither talked nor moved, almost as if he'd become a statue. When the trio noticed his absurd actions, they couldn't help but wonder what was up with the weirdo. Did it truly intend to stay still and do nothing? What kind of bullshit was that? But that aside, There was something else more pressing, so the weird boss would have to wait. They realized that the door exiting the room had disappeared, almost as if Lag was telling them they had to kill Laggard. But if so, how were they supposed to fight such a weird boss? Norman stepped forward, insisting that he had an idea. If it was just a matter of eliciting a reaction out of the fiend, then he had the best strategy. In his hand coalesced an orb of poison, which he swiftly yeeted toward Laggard. The orb struck true, causing the bastard's head to fling backward. When it did, Laggard's belly protruded forward, and I gotta say, this motherfucker is indeed ugly. However, judging by the thighs, at least we know he didn't skip leg day. Those thrusts must be hella mighty. Ahem. Jokes aside, the camera zoomed in on Laggard, showing the fate of the boss. Just as we'd expected, he easily tanked that shit, finding the attack more troublesome than deadly. Although half his face had melted off and it was supposed to be painful, the bastard couldn't be bothered to feel any of it. He was just too lazy to feel pain. Norman stared at the boss incredulously. Was this bastard for real? Was it still being lazy even after half its face was melted off? What kind of logic was that? Dwayne chimed in, expressing his doubts as well. Surely there had to be a limit to this absurdity. Or was it that the boss couldn't feel pain? Jeong corrected him, emphasizing what I had said earlier. The fool was just too lazy to feel pain. Since it was too troublesome to do so, he might as well cut off those useless senses. Although he'd said that, he couldn't help but wonder where the limit lay. Would Laggard still continue as usual if he attacked it? Well, there was only one way to find out. He swiftly channeled his electric powers, ready to blast the fiend. As for the fiend in question, it continued mumbling under its breath, complaining that it was such a pain. It was troublesome to fight, troublesome to think and talk, troublesome to kill, and even troublesome to have thoughts of killing someone. It was all too troublesome. But what should it do? It indeed hated feeling pain. So what should it do now that acting to stop that pain was also troublesome? It yelled out in despair, a tinge of confusion laced in its voice. When the voice sounded, it quickly morphed into a sonic attack, crashing into the trio. They immediately covered their ears, but even that wasn't enough to protect them fully. They felt their brains rattle, and Dwayne couldn't help but curse Laggard. If it found everything troublesome, then why was he attacking so viciously? He should have known it wasn't wise to trust the words of a big-nosed lunatic. Just as the trio were braving through the attack, Laggard suddenly smirked, seemingly coming to a realization. When Jeong saw that smirk, his danger senses flared, and his heart couldn't help but tighten. His instincts were warning him that something catastrophic was about to happen. Laggard, who was obviously the cause of this feeling, suddenly went dead silent before gazing up at the ceiling. He'd realized that his conundrum wasn't that hard to fix. If he found it too troublesome to think and do other things, then he could simply create another head to do all that for him. With that in mind, he calmly conjured another water blob, letting it float above him. From the blob dropped orbs of water, one of which landed on his head. Jeong, who was watching from the sidelines, said, "Fuck that," and immediately took action. Would he really be foolish enough to let the enemy cook while he watched? Nah, fuck that. He zapped that fool, drowning him in a torrent of lightning. Contrary to his expectations, Laggard easily tanked that shit, finding zero challenge in the endeavor. When he recovered, he shifted his gaze to the bewildered Jeong, shooting him a deadly glare. With a bone-chilling voice, he told the unit to wait for him. Once he got his second head, he'd make sure to properly polish his ass. Pause. Jeong heard the threat and trembled slightly. Since when did his delicate ass come under such threat in Lag? Well, forget it. Laggard was making his move, so now wasn't the time to think about it anyway. He immediately locked in, shifting his focus to the floating blobs in the air. However, to his shock, the blobs didn't just manifest in the air. They also spawned on the walls, effectively trapping them in a pincer attack. The clueless duo also picked up on this fact. Although they were dense, it didn't take a genius to know that something was definitely wrong. They quickly entered their fighting stances, but who knew if that would truly protect them from such an attack? Over at Laggard, he continued to mumble under his breath, calling everything troublesome. When the insanity peaked, he let loose his attack, blanketing the whole room with his blobs. Jeong, who was ready for an attack, couldn't help but curse. Why did it have to be an AoE attack of all things? How was he supposed to deal with this shit? Fuck. Although complaining felt great in the moment, he knew he couldn't afford to waste any more time. Thus, he immediately called for the duo to watch out, all whilst entering his limitation form. Thanks to the speed buff of the second door, time seemed to slow down around him, and Jeong could finally react to the harrowing attack. He first let it draw in before bitch-slapping the shit out of the blue orb, sending it flying like a kite. However, despite the CHADY performance, that was but a single orb, whilst the room was covered in them. If he didn't lock in, then he might just die there. Luckily, this was the maiden harvester we were talking about, so of course he'd have his own ways to survive. He swiftly channeled his inner Bruce Lee, unleashing his own version of the 100-type Guanyin Bodhisattva. Thanks to Netero's godly technique, he managed to weather the first wave of attacks. But that's where his luck ended. The subsequent attacks became even more dire, and Jeong once again found himself in a perilous situation. To the side was Dwayne, who was also facing his fair share of difficulties. Although he didn't have Jeong's cheat-like limitation skill, he was still hella sturdy, so he could endure the attacks, for now. Norman, however, wasn't faring so great. Without Jeong's limitation and Dwayne's sturdiness, he was relying on his own body to tank the attacks and, well, let's just say he was failing spectacularly. Even though the barrage had just begun, he was already at his limit, and if something wasn't done, he would for sure be the first to fall. When he realized that, he shot a pleading glance at Jeong and Dwayne, obviously asking for some help. Unluckily for the fool, Jeong and Dwayne were also going through it, with no room to intervene in his battlefield. They were fully concentrated on staying alive, so how could they drop everything and save his ass? Norman realized this and grit his teeth. It seemed he'd have to rely on himself this time. Whether he survived or was crushed to death by massive balls, it would be all up to him. Back to our boy Jeong, he did his best to swat away the pesky orbs. Unfortunately, despite his pimp slap being at max level, he still couldn't shake off the stubborn bastards. Slowly but surely, his stamina was draining, and it wouldn't be long until his resistance collapsed. Just as he was racking his brain for a solution, a possible Hail Mary to save his cooked ass, the room suddenly became dead silent. The orbs that were shooting toward them stopped, and all of them became stiff, not moving even an inch. Obviously, the trio were taken aback by this. Just what the hell was going on? Before they could deduce anything, the orbs started moving again, this time retreating back to Laggard. Under their confused gazes, the orbs surrounded Laggard, blocking and covering every inch of his body. Jeong watched the development and couldn't help but frown slightly. Just what was this dickless bastard plotting? But that aside, since when did the room take on this brownish hue? Moreover, when had the doors to the other rooms appeared? What the hell was going on there? Dwayne and Norman, who were beside him, also had the same doubts. They were curious to know what was going on, but one urge stood out amongst the rest. What if they used this change to escape to another room? Jeong immediately shot down that suggestion. If they couldn't even beat the weakest boss, then heading to the next room would just sign their death sentences. They had to kill this willyless bastard. Only then would they gain enough power to challenge the next door. Just as they were going over how to do it, a bizarre change occurred. One straight from a horror film. Several mouths sprouted from the orbs, all of them whispering in Laggard's voice. They grinned and laughed, occasionally mumbling troublesome over and over again, causing a chill to run down the trio's spines. As if that wasn't spooky enough, a vague outline of a face manifested amongst the mumbling mouths, further reinforcing the horrific feeling. Jeong saw the gross amalgamation of mouths and eyes and said, "Fuck that." There was no way he was letting this bastard do whatever it was he wanted to do. He would rather attack it now than live to regret it later. Besides, with how bizarrely his body was formed, it was clear it wouldn't be moving anytime soon. So what better time than now to use it as target practice? He immediately acted on this thought, activating his third door from the get-go. Beside him was Dwayne, who also unleashed his beast transformation skill. With the supreme power-ups, the duo, plus Norman, who seemed to be lacking aura in this aspect, faced off against the mutated Laggard, ready to clap some literal cheeks. Jeong was the first to act. After instructing the duo to attack simultaneously, he swiftly channeled his lightning strike, yeeting the blast towards Laggard. Next up was Dwayne, who roared at the fiend, sending a powerful shockwave toward it. Last, and definitely the least, was Norman, who chucked an underwhelming orb of poison towards Laggard. Although his attack was pure garbage, he was luckily teamed up with Titans, so his shortcomings were mostly ignored, just like his shortcoming. As for Laggard, he suffered the worst of it, with plenty of tongues and mouths rupturing. After the first volley, the bastard was reduced to a mangled mess, though traces of life still lingered in him. Jeong realized this and cautioned the duo against lowering their guard. He then turned to Dwayne, asking the latter to do his thing. Dwayne said, "Bet," and walked forward. When he was slightly ahead of the gang, he immediately entered a punching stance before striking the hell out of the ground. Due to his overwhelming attack, a huge boulder was yanked from the ground, which he effortlessly lifted into the air. With the DIY weapon in tow, he swiftly chucked it at Laggard, causing a swooshing sound as it shot toward the fool. To no one's surprise, the boulder struck him like a, boulder, digging deep into his body. The force from the impact was so severe that Laggard was sent flying, only stopping after crashing brutally against the room wall. Beneath him was a pool of blood, which showed just how much damage he'd taken. Just as the trio were about to celebrate their victory, a low and grating voice mumbled, complaining about how troublesome it was. The gang heard this, and their expressions couldn't help but twist. How was this bastard still alive? Especially after that last attack. Before they could figure it out, Laggard resumed his mumbling, this time, his voice growing louder and louder. Accompanying the voice were the subtle sounds of cracking, obviously coming from the boulder. To the Chad's horror, the boulder suddenly shattered, sending shards of rock flying everywhere. Indeed, things could always get worse in Lag.